Hello everyone. Welcome to Mr. Midnight True Crime Stories. I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep. Quick question for my fellow crime junkies. Where are you watching this from right now? Midnight scrolling in bed? Headphones in at the gym? Sneaking an episode during lunch break? Tell me where in the world you are and what device you're on. I love seeing how this community shows up. Don't forget to like the video and subscribe if you're ready for more chilling stories. Now, before we begin tonight, I want you to do something for me. I want you to take a slow breath in, hold it for just a moment, and then let it go. Let your shoulders drop. Let your jaw unclench. Let your hands go soft against whatever surface they're resting on right now. Because tonight, we are not in a hurry. Tonight, we are going to a place that most people have never heard of. We are going to a city that smelled of gasoline and river water and cigarette smoke. A city that was alive in the way that only cities in the 1920s knew how to be alive. Loud and brilliant, and secretly terrified underneath all that jazz and glitter. We are going to Boston, Massachusetts. And we are going to the year 1925. And we are going to walk through a door that, once opened, will ask you questions it cannot answer. It will give you facts, and then it will give you silence, and it will leave you to decide what the silence means. Settle in, my sleepy friends. Lower your volume just a touch if you need to. This story will wait for you. It has been waiting for 100 years already, and it will wait a little longer while you get comfortable. Boston in the winter of 1925 was a city that knew how to keep secrets. It had been doing it for a long time, since before the Revolution, since before the harbor and the tea and the muskets. And by the time the 1920s rolled in with their short skirts and their speakeasies and their desperate, glittering hunger for everything new, Boston had simply added a few more layers of shadow to its already considerable collection. The streets were slick with rain that year. They always seemed to be, in memory. The cobblestones of the older districts reflected the gas lamps in long orange streaks, and the newer parts of town, the parts that had electricity, threw white light out across the pavement in pools that the darkness gathered around, watching. It was a city that understood theater. And on a particular evening in February, one of the most theatrical things it would ever see was about to begin, not on any of its famous stages, but in a hotel corridor on a quiet floor where no one should have been paying attention. The Hotel Hollis sat on Hollis Street in Boston's theater district, and it was the kind of hotel that a certain kind of traveler chose with purpose. It was not the grandest hotel in the city. It was not the sort of place where politicians held court or where heiresses swept through lobbies in fur coats. It was a working hotel, clean and respectable, with good enough beds and reliable enough service that the theatrical community, the actors and singers and stagehands and wardrobe mistresses who moved up and down the eastern seaboard like birds following the warmth of applause, had made it something of a home away from home. When a company came to Boston, they often stayed at the Hollis. When a show was running at one of the nearby theaters, you might find half its cast in the dining room on a Tuesday evening, still pink-cheeked from the stage lights, laughing too loudly and ordering too much coffee and talking about everything except how tired they were. May Price knew the Hollis well. She had stayed there before. She was the kind of woman who made a point of knowing things, who knew which hotels had the thickest curtains and which train stations had the best coffee and which stagehands could be trusted to have a needle and thread when a costume ripped 10 minutes before curtain. She was the wardrobe mistress for the Brown Derby Company, and if you don't know what a wardrobe mistress does, then let me tell you gently that she does everything. She is the invisible machinery behind every beautiful thing you see on a stage. She repairs and prepares. She tracks and inventories. She soothes and organizes. And in a traveling theatrical company, she is often the one person that everyone else brings their problems to, because she has the kind of steady, capable energy that makes you feel like everything is going to be all right, even when it isn't. The people who worked with May Price called her the mother of the troupe. Not as a figure of speech, exactly. More as a statement of fact. She was the woman you went to when your costume needed mending and when your heart did too. She was practical and warm, and she had the sort of laugh that made other people laugh without quite knowing why. She was not young. She was a woman in her middle years, with a husband named Bill back in New York and a life that had taken her to hundreds of hotel rooms in dozens of cities. But she had never lost the quality that made people trust her instinctively. There was something solid about May Price. Something real. In a world full of theatrical people who wore masks for a living, she was a woman who seemed to have no masks at all. On the night of February 9th, 1925, May Price went to her room at the Hotel Hollis. She was in room 406, a standard room on the 4th floor. The company had been performing in Boston for the past week, and tomorrow morning she was supposed to be on a train to New York. She had her bags packed, or mostly packed. She had been given the pay envelopes for several members of the company to distribute, because she was the one people trusted with money. She was carrying at least $80 in her own pay envelope, and she was holding an additional $60 that a cast member had asked her to keep safe. Some accounts would later put the total she was carrying at closer to $200. This matters, because it is the first thread you pull when you try to unravel what happened next. Somewhere in the night, in the quiet hours when most of the hotel had gone to sleep, something happened in room 406. We know this because of what the morning revealed. We know this because of what a bellboy saw when he was sent to check on a guest who had not come down for breakfast and who had not responded to a knock at her door. The bellboy's name is not the one history remembers most clearly from this case, but his words are. He ran. He ran down 4 flights of stairs, through the lobby, out into the street, and all the way to Division 4 Station House, which was close enough that the run, breathless as it was, took only a few minutes. And when he got there, when he found someone in authority and managed to get the words out through his gasping and his white-faced shock, what he said was this: "It looks like murder." Let's sit with that for a moment. It looks like murder. Those are words that change everything they touch. Those are words that turned a quiet Tuesday morning into something else entirely. Something that would occupy the minds of Boston's police department for months. That would put an innocent woman's life under a microscope. That would send investigators across 3 states chasing a ghost through cheap hotels and demolished houses. And that would ultimately end in a courtroom decision so strange and so unsatisfying that people are still talking about it a century later. The officers who responded to the Hotel Hollis that morning moved quickly, the way officers always move when those particular words have been used. They went up to the 4th floor. They went to room 406. And what they found there was a scene that would test every skill and every instinct they had. Mrs. May Price was lying face down on the floor of her hotel room. Her hands were bound behind her back. Around her, the room told a story of violence. Furniture disturbed, objects out of place, the small signs of a struggle that had happened in a space too confined for anyone involved to move freely. There was an indentation in the pillow on the bed, the kind that suggests someone pressed it down with considerable force. And underneath the bed, almost out of sight, there was a cigarette. A single cigarette, unsmoked, as though it had been dropped in the dark by someone who hadn't wanted to be seen. The medical examiner who was called to the scene was a man named Dr. Timothy Leary. Not the Timothy Leary you might be thinking of, a different one, an earlier one, a man of science and procedure who had seen death in many forms and had learned to read what it left behind. Dr. Leary examined May Price carefully, and what he found told a story of tremendous violence. She had been strangled. She had broken ribs. And on her hands, beneath her fingernails, there were traces of skin that did not belong to her. She had fought. She had fought hard, in that small room, in the middle of the night, with her hands eventually bound and her strength failing. She had fought, and she had left a mark on whoever had done this to her. The time of death, Dr. Leary estimated, was somewhere around 2 in the morning. The hotel had been quiet. No one had heard a thing. And that, my sleepy friends, is where the real mystery begins. Because a woman was murdered in a hotel room, violently and deliberately, and no one heard a sound. And the door, when the bellboy found her, was secured from the inside. How does a killer get out of a room that is locked from within? How does a struggle that broke a woman's ribs happen in silence? And what was the killer doing there in the first place? Was this a robbery gone wrong? Or something planned, something patient and cold and waiting? The investigators who began walking through room 406 that morning did not yet know the answers to any of those questions. What they knew was that a woman who had been trusted and loved and called mother by people who worked beside her every day was lying on the floor of a hotel room. And she was dead, and someone in the city of Boston knew exactly why. They just had to find out who. The cigarette under the bed would matter. The skin beneath her fingernails would matter. A key from a room upstairs would matter. A man who had been seen lurking on the upper floors, large and rough and out of place, would matter more than anything else. But all of that was still ahead. On that February morning in 1925, the investigators had a body, a bound pair of hands, a disturbed room, and a cigarette. They had the beginning of a mystery that would refuse, stubbornly and almost beautifully, to let itself be solved easily. The detectives who caught the case began with the most logical place, the victim herself. Who was May Price, really? Where had she come from? Who might have wanted to harm her? These are the questions that begin every investigation, the baseline questions, the ones that seem almost too obvious to ask, but that always matter. And so they began to ask them. They began to call on the members of the Brown Derby Company, one by one, and they began to listen. And what they heard was consistent and heartbreaking, and ultimately not very helpful in the way they needed it to be. Because everyone who knew May Price said the same thing. She was good. She was kind. She was trusted. She had no enemies. She was a woman who made other people's lives easier, not harder, and the idea that anyone would want to harm her was met with a kind of stunned incomprehension that the investigators recognized as genuine. May's husband, Bill Price, was in New York. His alibi was confirmed quickly and thoroughly. He was not a suspect. He was a husband who received a telephone call that morning that no husband should ever receive, and who made the journey to Boston as quickly as he could, and who arrived in a state that those who saw him would later describe only as devastated. Bill Price was not the answer to any of the investigators' questions. He was simply a man who had lost his wife, and the weight of that loss followed him through the hotel corridors like a shadow that couldn't be shaken. The money was the most obvious motive. Nearly $200, in a time when $200 was significant, when it represented weeks of work for a working-class family, when it could mean the difference between comfort and hardship. Someone had known that May Price was carrying money, or someone had assumed she was, given that she was the wardrobe mistress, the person responsible for the company's payroll envelopes. Either way, the money was gone. Every cent of it. The pay envelopes were not in the room. May's personal funds were not in the room. Whatever she had been carrying when she went to sleep the night before had been taken. But here is the thing that kept nagging at the investigators, the thing that they kept coming back to even when they tried to put it aside. The violence was excessive. A robbery. Even a robbery that goes wrong. Even a robbery where the victim wakes up and struggles and has to be subdued does not typically result in broken ribs and strangulation and bound hands. A robbery that turns violent usually ends faster than that. What had happened in room 406 had taken time. It had taken effort. It had taken a particular kind of ruthlessness that felt personal, even if the perpetrator had never met May Price before that night. This was no ordinary robbery, one of the investigators said, standing in that room, looking at what remained of the life of Mrs. May Price. And the words hung in the air of that hotel room like smoke from the cigarette that was still lying under the bed, waiting to tell its story. There is something about a hotel room in the early hours of the morning that is unlike any other space. The world outside is dark and still, and the sounds of the city have gone soft and distant, and the room itself seems to breathe. The radiator ticking, the curtains barely moving in some draft from an old window frame. The small creaks and shifts of a building settling into the cold night. It is a space of profound privacy. You are surrounded by strangers, but you are alone. And that loneliness, that particular solitude, is something that the investigators had to think about when they tried to understand what had happened to May Price. She had been alone in room 406. The members of the Brown Derby Company were distributed across various rooms in the hotel, and some were staying elsewhere in the city, and none of them had been with May that night. She had said her goodnights, and she had gone to her room, and she had apparently not opened the door again to anyone she recognized or trusted. Or perhaps she had. Perhaps she had been deceived. Perhaps someone had knocked with a story that had made sense at the time. Perhaps the last face May Price saw was a familiar one wearing an unfamiliar expression. The investigators didn't know, and not knowing drove them deeper into the details of the hotel itself. The Hotel Hollis was the kind of place where the staff knew things. Hotel staff always do. They move through the building at all hours, invisible in the way that service workers are made invisible by the expectations of the people they serve. And in that invisibility, they see everything. The bellboys and the maids and the desk clerks and the night staff. These were the people the investigators needed to talk to, and they talked to them carefully and thoroughly, going back again and again to ask the questions in different ways, to see if a detail might surface that hadn't come up the first time. And things did surface. Not all at once. Not in the dramatic way that stories sometimes compress these revelations into a single moment of clarity. It was slower than that. It was the accumulation of small details over hours and days that began to build a picture of the night of February 9th. A picture that was still incomplete, but that was starting to have edges. One of the most significant details came from another floor of the hotel entirely. On the 6th floor, in room 606, there had been a birthday party the previous evening. Nothing wild or disruptive, just a group of theatrical people celebrating together, laughing and eating and being human in the way that people who spend most of their lives performing need to be, sometimes, offstage. The party had gone on for several hours, and at some point during the evening, the key to room 606 had been left in the door. Just left there, a common enough carelessness, the kind of thing that happens when people are relaxed and comfortable and not thinking about security because they have no reason to be thinking about security. The key to room 606 was missing by the following morning. Think about that for a moment. Someone, on that floor, at some point during those evening hours, had taken a hotel room key. And then a woman on the 4th floor had been murdered, and the door to her room had been secured from the inside. The investigators began to consider a possibility that was both simple and deeply unsettling. What if the door had been secured from the inside because the killer was still on the inside when the door was found locked? What if someone had gotten into room 406 through deception or force, through an unlocked door or a moment of inattention, and had then waited? What if the cigarette under the bed was there because someone had been lying under that bed, in the dark and the silence, waiting for May Price to come back to her room and for the hotel to go quiet around them? It was a theory. It was only a theory. But it was the kind of theory that, once it takes hold of you, doesn't let go. And the investigators held on to it carefully as they continued their work. Because there was more. There was the woman on the upper floor. Miss May Jensen was a vaudeville actress, and she had been staying at the Hotel Hollis during the same period. She was a professional who had spent her career learning to read audiences, to read rooms, to read the quality of attention that any given space was paying to her. She was not easily frightened. She was not the sort of woman who startled at shadows. But on the evening before May Price was found dead, Miss Jensen had encountered something on one of the hotel's upper floors that had frightened her enough that she had turned around and walked quickly back the way she had come. She described what she had seen as a large man. Large in a way that commanded attention, in a way that was not entirely explained by his height. There was a quality of mass and power to him that she found immediately unsettling, even before he had done or said anything threatening. He was rough-looking, she said. The word she kept coming back to was rough. Not rough in the way of a laboring man or a man who worked outdoors. Rough in a different way, a harder way, the kind of roughness that comes from something other than honest work. He had looked at her, and she had looked at him, and something in the way he looked at her had made every instinct she possessed tell her to leave. She left. She did not report the encounter that night. She had no reason to. A strange man in a hotel corridor is not, by itself, a crime. She went back to her room, and she thought about it, and she told herself it was nothing, and she went to sleep. And the next morning, she heard what had happened to May Price, and the man from the corridor came rushing back to her in full and vivid detail. The investigators listened to Miss Jensen's account with great care. What she was describing, a large, rough man on the upper floors of the hotel, on the same evening as the murder, was not evidence in the legal sense. It was a description, and descriptions are notoriously unreliable. But it was a thread, and they were looking for threads. The medical examiner's report gave them another thread, or rather, it sharpened a thread they already had. Dr. Leary noted that the injuries to May Price were consistent with having been caused by a person with large hands. The strangulation, the distribution of force in the beating, these suggested size and strength. A big person, a powerful person, someone who had been able to subdue a woman who was fighting back hard enough to draw blood with her fingernails. Large hands, a large, rough man on the upper floors. These details were not yet a case, but they were beginning to point in the same direction. Meanwhile, the investigators were dealing with something that every investigator of every crime in every era eventually has to deal with: the complete and utter absence of useful physical evidence. In 1925, the science of forensics was in its infancy. Fingerprinting existed and was being used, but it was unreliable and incomplete and depended heavily on finding clean, usable prints on suitable surfaces, which the Hotel Hollis did not provide in any convenient abundance. The cigarette under the bed was collected and examined, but cigarette analysis in 1925 was not the precise science it would later become. The skin under May Price's fingernails was noted, but there was no way to connect it definitively to any specific individual without a direct comparison that required having the suspect in custody first. The investigators had a direction, but no destination. They had suspicion, but no proof. And the case, which had begun with such urgency and such clarity of purpose, was beginning to slow. This is the part of a story that is hardest to sit with. Not the violence. The violence is terrible, but it is contained, it happened, and then it was over. The hardest part is the waiting and the frustration and the slow grinding feeling that justice might not come. The investigators knew this feeling. They had felt it before. Every case has a moment where the energy of the initial discovery runs out, and you are left with the bare facts and the blank spaces between them, and you have to decide whether you are going to keep going. Most of them, after a while, were pulled in other directions. The Boston Police Department had other cases, other crises, other demands on its attention and its resources. The Hotel Hollis murder was assigned its file number and its investigator, and it was put into the machinery of the department, and the machinery ground on. But the machinery was slow, and the leads were cold, and weeks passed. Anonymous letters arrived. This always happens in high-profile cases. People write in with theories and accusations and wild suggestions, most of them useless, some of them malicious, a tiny fraction of them occasionally pointing towards something real. The investigators read every one. They followed up on the ones that seemed worth following up on. They investigated men from the South End of Boston who had criminal histories and who matched various parts of the description that had been offered. They found nothing. They investigated connections to the theatrical world, to people who might have known May Price was carrying money, to people who might have had a grudge or a desperation or an opportunity. They found nothing that held. The cigarette remained under examination. The skin beneath the fingernails remained in a jar in an evidence room somewhere, waiting for a suspect who hadn't yet been identified. The key from room 606 had never been recovered. And then, one by one, the investigators were reassigned. Other cases pressed in. The urgency faded. The file was still open, technically. It was always technically still open. But in practical terms, the Hotel Hollis case was going cold. There was one exception. Sergeant Thomas Harvey was the kind of investigator who doesn't let things go. Not because he is immune to the pressures of time and caseload and departmental priority. He wasn't, and he felt all of those pressures as sharply as anyone. But because there are some cases that take hold of you in a way that is more personal than professional, and the murder of May Price had done that to Thomas Harvey. He had seen her room. He had read Dr. Leary's report. He had spoken to the people who loved her, and he had heard in their voices the shape of who she was. And that shape had settled into him like a splinter. He couldn't work free. He was not a sentimental man, not especially, but he was a thorough one. And thoroughness, in the long run, is more valuable than brilliance. Harvey kept the file on his desk. He kept asking questions in the places that investigators tend to ask questions, in the margins of other cases, in conversations with informants, in the kind of low-grade ongoing attention that doesn't look like work, but that is, actually, the most important kind of work. He was listening. He was waiting. He was letting the case breathe, because sometimes that is all you can do, and sometimes it is enough. The months turned. Spring came to Boston, and then summer, and then the beginning of fall. And somewhere in that long, slow turning of time, a name began to surface. It didn't come from a tip line, or a forensic breakthrough, or a clever deduction. It came from the street, the way the most important information almost always comes, quietly, obliquely, from someone who had heard something and had sat on it for a while before deciding that the right person might want to know. Someone who knew something about a man who had been in the wrong part of the city at the wrong time. A man who was large and rough and whose name had a shadow attached to it. Harvey received the information in the way that good investigators receive information, carefully, without excitement, without tipping his hand. He listened. He asked the follow-up questions that seemed natural rather than urgent. And when the conversation was over, he went back to his desk, and he sat with what he had heard. A name. Not a certain name. Not a proven name. Not even a real name, as it turned out. But a name. And sometimes a name is the first solid thing you have to hold on to in a case that has been nothing but air and shadow for months. The name that surfaced first was Benny Peretti. But Benny Peretti was not the man Harvey was looking for. Benny Peretti was the man who could lead him to the man he was looking for, and that distinction, the difference between the informant and the subject, was one that Harvey understood clearly. He treated Benny Peretti accordingly. And Benny Peretti, after some persuasion and some patience and some careful handling, gave Harvey what he needed. A description, a location, and a word that Harvey's informant used, almost casually, a word that stuck. Look for the big gorilla. Harvey looked. The word gorilla, used the way Benny Peretti used it, meant something specific in the language of the 1920s underworld. It meant a man of exceptional size and strength, a man who was used for physical work of the most brutal kind, a man whose usefulness to certain employers lay entirely in his capacity for violence. It was not a flattering term, but it was not meant to be. It was meant to be descriptive and accurate, and in this case, it was both. Harvey began to ask around. He asked in the places where asking would do the most good, and he asked in the careful, sideways manner that good investigators develop over years of practice. Never quite asking the direct question, circling in from the edges, letting the answer come toward him rather than reaching for it. And gradually, incrementally, a shape began to emerge from the fog of rumor and street corner information. The shape had a name. Several names, actually, because men who operate in the shadow spaces of any city tend to collect names the way other people collect habits. Out of necessity, out of self-preservation, out of the simple practical need to be someone else when being yourself becomes inconvenient. But the name that Harvey eventually brought back to his superiors, the name that he was able to attach to a real person and a real history, was Frank Corey. Frank Corey. Written down like that, it sounds almost unremarkable. An ordinary name. The kind of name that wouldn't turn heads in any crowd. But the file that came back from Leavenworth Federal Penitentiary when Superintendent Crowley requested it was anything but ordinary. Frank Corey was a man with a history so extensive and so violent that reading through it required a kind of steadying of the nerves that even experienced investigators sometimes needed. The file described a man who had been through the penitentiary system, who had accumulated charges and convictions and periods of confinement in a way that told the story of someone who had been operating outside the law for a very long time, and who had no particular intention of stopping. He had escaped once. That detail alone would have been enough to fix him in Harvey's attention, but it was the manner of the escape that was really remarkable. Frank Corey had gotten out of Leavenworth by going through a sewer pipe. Think about that for a moment. Think about the kind of determination, the kind of physical capability, the kind of absolute refusal to accept constraint that it takes to escape through a sewer pipe. This was not a man who was deterred by difficulty. This was not a man who gave up when the way forward was unpleasant. This was a man who went through sewer pipes and came out the other side. He had aliases, of course. Benny Peretti had called him the Wop, which was a slur that Harvey noted and set aside. It told him about Frank Corey's ethnic background as perceived by his associates, but it didn't tell him anything useful for finding him. What was more useful was the alias Benny Peretti had also mentioned, the name that Frank Corey used when he checked into hotels. And when Harvey went back to the Hotel Hollis and spoke again to the desk clerk who had been working in the days before the murder, the clerk, looking at the photograph that had arrived from Leavenworth, went quiet for a moment. And then he said yes. Yes, he remembered this man. He had checked in a few days before the murder, not to room 406, but to another room, room 512. He had given the name Frank Muliono. He had paid cash, and he had been quiet. And he had stayed for a couple of days and then checked out, and no one had thought anything of it because quiet cash-paying guests were not unusual at the Hollis. Theaters brought all kinds of people through, and not all of them were theatrical. Harvey sat with this information. He let it settle. He arranged it alongside everything else he knew. Frank Corey, under the name Frank Muliono, had been in the Hotel Hollis in the days before May Price's murder. He had been on the premises. He had been watching the building, watching the guests, watching the flow of money that theatrical companies always carried with them. He had checked out before the murder, which meant he was not registered when it happened, which meant that whatever he had done to get back into the building after his checkout was something he had planned or improvised in the moment. And that key from room 606, the key that had gone missing during the birthday party. A key that could have been taken by anyone who had access to that floor, who could move through a hotel without drawing attention, who was experienced enough in the particular art of not being noticed to take what he needed and wait. The theory that was building in Harvey's mind was not a simple robbery gone wrong. It was something more deliberate than that. A man had checked into the hotel under a false name, had spent time learning the layout and the patterns of the guests, had taken a key, had come back after checking out, had gotten into a room, had waited in the dark and the silence for the occupant to return, and had then done what he came to do. And when it was done, he had used the stolen key, or some other method that the investigators had not yet determined, to secure the room from the inside and then slip out, leaving behind nothing but a cigarette and the marks of May Price's last defense. It was a theory. It was a compelling theory. But it was still a theory, and theories do not convict. Evidence convicts. Witnesses convict. And Harvey needed both. What he had was Miss Jensen's description, which was consistent with Frank Corey. What he had was the hotel clerk's identification of the photograph, which was promising but not definitive. What he had was a connection between Frank Corey and the Hotel Hollis in the days before the murder, which established opportunity but not guilt. What he did not yet have was the man himself. Frank Corey, it turned out, had not been sitting still. Harvey began to trace the movements of a man who very much did not want to be traced, which is a particular kind of investigative work, methodical, frustrating, occasionally illuminating, rarely fast. The leads came in fragments. Yonkers, New York. A neighborhood, a building, a landlady. Harvey sent inquiries. The building had been demolished. The landlady was dead. The trail that had seemed to be solidifying was suddenly, frustratingly liquid again. A woman was mentioned, a Polish woman, blonde, someone who had been connected to Corey during the period in question. Harvey followed this thread with the patient diligence of a man who has learned that every thread eventually leads somewhere, even if the somewhere is not where you hoped. He found pieces of the story, an address, a history, a timeline. But the address led to another dead end, and the history led to more aliases, and the timeline was full of gaps that Corey seemed to have deliberately created, because a man who has spent years evading law enforcement knows how to leave gaps. The work was wearing. It was the kind of work that doesn't appear in the dramatic retellings because it has no drama, just days and weeks of careful inquiry producing small fragments that don't yet add up to the picture you need. Harvey kept his desk covered in notes. He kept his questions going. He kept the case alive in the only way he could, which was through sheer persistence. And then Worcester came up. A city in the middle of Massachusetts, not far from Boston in the scale of distances, but worlds away in character, quieter, more provincial, a city that minded its own business in a way that Boston, for all its history, sometimes didn't quite manage. An address in Worcester. A room in a rooming house. A name. The question now was how to approach it. And this is where Harvey showed the quality that distinguished him not just as an investigator, but as a strategist. He did not want to alert Frank Corey. He did not want to send men in uniform to a door and have the door answered by someone who would say that yes, they knew the man. But no, he wasn't here right now, and no, they didn't know when he'd be back. He wanted the man himself. He wanted the actual Frank Corey, in the room, with nowhere to go. The plan that Harvey and his team constructed was elegant in its simplicity. They went to the rooming house in Worcester. They spoke to the landlady. And they presented themselves not as police officers investigating a murder, but as city health inspectors who had received a complaint about the sewer system. There were concerns, they explained, about drainage. They needed to check the pipes in the building. The landlady was cooperative. What landlady wouldn't be when health inspectors come with official manner and official paperwork? She let them in. She showed them around. And they waited. Because the information they had indicated that Frank Corey was not in the room at that moment, but was expected back. And so they waited, with the patience that all of this long year of work had taught them, and they watched. He came home on a trolley. He came up the street in the ordinary way, a man returning to his room at the end of a day, not running, not looking over his shoulder, apparently not alarmed. And Harvey watched him come, and made the decision, and moved. The arrest was quiet. That detail matters, because it tells you something about Frank Corey. Not that he was calm or cooperative, but that he was too smart to make a scene on a public street. He was brought in. He was sat down. And then the interrogation began. Frank Corey denied everything. He denied ever having been in Boston. He denied knowing anything about the Hotel Hollis. He denied recognizing any photograph that was placed before him, denied any connection to any name that was mentioned, denied any knowledge of May Price or the Brown Derby Company or any event of February 9th, 1925. He was fluent in denial, the way a man becomes fluent in a language he has spoken for years. His face was steady. His voice was level. He had been through interrogations before, and he knew how to sit inside one without cracking. When a statement was prepared, a careful document laying out the evidence against him and asking for his response, Frank Corey looked at it and refused to sign. A lawyer arrived. After that, the room was quieter still. Harvey sat across from Frank Corey and looked at him. Corey looked back. And in that silence, in that particular quality of standoff that exists between an investigator who knows something and a suspect who knows that the investigator knows it, something was established that would carry through to the trial. Harvey believed, without any remaining doubt, that he was looking at the man who had killed May Price. And Frank Corey, whatever he believed or felt or feared, had chosen silence as his weapon. Silence. The same silence that had surrounded the murder of May Price in room 406. The same silence that the hotel had maintained through that long February night. It seemed to follow this case like a companion, moving through every stage of it, from the moment of the crime through the investigation and now into this interrogation room in Worcester, where a large and dangerous man sat across from a patient and determined sergeant, and neither one of them said anything at all. Harvey went home that night and thought about what he had. He thought about Miss Jensen and the photograph and the hotel clerk and the key and the cigarette and the theory about the space under the bed. He thought about the skin beneath May Price's fingernails and the description of large hands and the escaped convict who had gotten out of Leavenworth through a sewer pipe. He had a case. He believed he had a case. Whether 12 people in a jury box would agree was the question he could not yet answer. The charge was murder. The trial would come. And what happened in that courtroom would be one of the most unexpected endings to an investigation that had already been full of surprises. Let me take you back for a moment before we go forward. Because in the telling of a story like this one, it is important to pause sometimes and remember who we are talking about. Not the suspect, not the investigators, but May Price, the woman at the center. She had been a wardrobe mistress for many years by the time she came to Boston in February of 1925. This was not a glamorous profession, not in the way that the theater could be glamorous. The actors and the directors and the leading ladies got the glamour, and the wardrobe mistress got the needle and thread and the measuring tape and the costume trunks that had to be loaded onto trains in the cold dark of early morning and unloaded on the other end and opened and checked and arranged before anyone else had thought about being awake. She got the work, and she had done that work for years, in city after city, in theater after theater, with a consistency and a competence that had made her irreplaceable. The Brown Derby Company was lucky to have her, and they knew it. The members of the troupe, who had worked with her for long enough to understand what she meant to the smooth functioning of everything they did, had given her the nickname Mother, not sarcastically, not in the way that nicknames sometimes carry a small edge of irony, but with genuine affection and genuine respect. She was the person who held things together. She was the person who knew where everything was and who remembered what everyone needed and who could fix a costume emergency in 10 minutes flat with whatever happened to be in reach. She was the person who listened. She was the person who remembered birthdays. She was the person who, when someone in the company was having a hard time, appeared quietly with a cup of coffee and stayed until the hard time had passed a little. She was also the person trusted with money, which tells you everything you need to know about the character she had built over years of being exactly who she was. Trust is not given in theatrical companies any more freely than it is given anywhere else. The world of traveling theater in the 1920s was a world of tight margins and constant financial anxiety, and people who were charming and talented, but sometimes unreliable. May Price was reliable. She was the standard by which reliability was measured. When the pay envelopes needed to be distributed and safeguarded and accounted for, it was May Price who carried them. And on the night of February 9th, she was carrying them to bed. Her husband Bill was expecting her home the next morning. She had been on the road for the run of the company's Boston engagement, and the engagement was ending, and she was coming home. He was probably making plans in his head the way spouses do when someone they love has been away for a while. thinking about what they would have for dinner, thinking about what news they'd exchanged over letters, and whether there was anything left to catch up on face to face, thinking about the simple, ordinary pleasure of having the other person in the house again. He did not know, on the night of February 9th, that May would not be coming home. He went to bed that night, not knowing anything was wrong. The call came the next morning. There is a particular cruelty to the way terrible news travels, the way it travels by ordinary means, a telephone call, a knock at a door, someone's voice saying words that collapse everything around them. Bill Price received his terrible news by telephone, and then he made arrangements and got on a train and came to Boston, and what he found there was not his wife on a platform waiting for him, but a hotel room and a police department and a fact that no one could change. He moved through those days like a man who is still, on some level, waiting for someone to tell him it was a mistake. He went home eventually, without her, and the ordinary pleasure he had been imagining, the dinner, the catching up, the simple presence of the other person, was never going to happen. The investigators spoke to Bill Price, of course. They had to. He was her husband, and in any murder investigation, the people closest to the victim are always the first to be examined. Bill Price submitted to this examination with the cooperative numbness of a grieving person who understands the necessity of what is happening even if every part of him wants to be somewhere else doing something that isn't this. His alibi was solid. Multiple people in New York could account for his whereabouts on the night of February 9th. He was not a suspect in any meaningful sense. He was simply, as the investigators recorded, the husband. That clinical designation, stripped of everything it actually meant, was the only way the paperwork could hold him. The people of the Brown Derby Company were also interviewed, each of them separately and carefully. They were a close-knit group in the way that theatrical companies tend to be, thrown together by circumstance and held together by the peculiar intimacy of performing for audiences night after night, of sharing the particular adrenaline and exhaustion of stage work. They cared about each other, in the way of people who have been through a particular kind of shared experience. And they cared about May Price, which was evident in the way they talked about her, the past tense arriving like a collision every time it was used, the voice faltering slightly, the composure requiring a conscious effort to maintain. No one in the company had heard anything the night of February 9th. They went through the party in room 606. They accounted for their evening hours, and then they had gone to their respective rooms and slept, and none of them had been awakened by any sound from the fourth floor, and none of them had seen anyone suspicious, and none of them had any information that seemed like it would help. The gap between what the investigators needed and what the witnesses could provide was wide and quiet, and filled with nothing useful. The party in room 606 was examined in particular detail. The investigators wanted to know exactly who had been there, exactly what had happened with the room key, exactly when people had arrived and departed, and what the movements in and out of that room had looked like over the course of the evening. They got a picture of an ordinary celebration, theater people relaxing after a performance, eating and talking and laughing, and eventually going to bed. Nothing unusual, nothing alarming, except that at some point during that evening, someone had removed the key from the door of room 606, and that person was not among the people who had been at the party. The key was the thing that kept coming back. It was the thing that changed the shape of the entire investigation, because a missing hotel key implies deliberate action. Keys don't disappear on their own. Keys disappear when someone takes them. And if someone took the key to room 606, they took it for a reason. And if the reason had anything to do with gaining access to another part of the hotel, a part that a hotel key might help you reach or might help you appear to belong in, then the key was part of the planning, not an accident. Harvey worked through the theory many times. In a large hotel like the Hollis, rooms on the same floor were usually keyed differently, but master keys existed, and a key from one room might in certain circumstances be made to work in another, or might at least provide a plausible reason for being on a floor where you didn't belong. If you were a large, rough man moving through a hotel in the middle of the night, and someone challenged you, having a key in your hand changed the nature of the confrontation. You could say you were going to your room. You could say you'd gotten confused about floors. A key in the hand made you, at a glance, a guest. Without it, you were an intruder. And then there was the theory about the bed. This was the part of the case that Harvey found both the most compelling and the most disturbing. The evidence of the scene, the pillow, the bound hands, the nature of the injuries, the fact that no one had heard anything and that the door had been secured from inside, pointed to a possibility that was, in its cold-blooded deliberateness, almost hard to comprehend. The possibility that Frank Corey, or whoever had committed this crime, had gotten into room 406 before May Price returned to it for the night, had gotten in and hidden, possibly under the bed, had lain in the dark, in the silence, waiting for her to come back, waiting for the sounds of the floor to settle and the hotel to go quiet, and had then acted. The cigarette under the bed seemed to support this. It had not been smoked. It had been dropped, perhaps in the dark, perhaps while adjusting a position, perhaps simply as the kind of small inadvertent accident that happens when a person is lying still for a long time in a confined space and something slips from their pocket or their hand. A dropped cigarette is not proof of anything. But in context, against the backdrop of everything else, it was a specific kind of detail that felt true in the way that specific details often do. Too small and too particular to have been invented. The investigators held this theory. They refined it. They tested it against the physical evidence and found that it held. They tested it against the timeline and found that it was consistent. They brought it to the prosecution and found that the prosecution believed it was powerful. And then they took Frank Corey, who had been charged with murder, who had maintained his silence in the interrogation room, and they brought him to trial. The trial of Frank Corey for the murder of May Price began in the spring of 1925, and it was watched by the city of Boston with the particular intensity that murder trials attract: the hunger to see justice done, the fascination with the machinery of law and evidence and testimony, the collective need to have the shape of the tragedy resolved into something that made sense. The newspapers covered it. The public formed opinions. The theatrical community in Boston, which had known May Price as a visitor if not personally, paid attention. The evidence that the prosecution presented was, when laid out in sequence, genuinely compelling. There were the scratches. In the days after Corey's arrest, investigators had examined him closely and found marks on his face and body consistent with having been in a physical altercation, consistent, specifically, with having been scratched by someone fighting for their life. May Price had fought. Dr. Leary had found the skin beneath her fingernails. The scratches on Frank Corey were not proof, but they were consistent. There was the cigarette brand. The cigarette found under the bed in room 406 was of a specific brand and type. When Corey's belongings were searched, cigarettes of the same brand were found. This was circumstantial. Many people smoked the same brand, but it was another thread in the same direction. There was the raincoat. A particular raincoat had been associated with the man seen in the hotel corridor, the large rough man that Miss Jensen had described and that the hotel clerk had also mentioned. A raincoat was recovered in connection with Frank Corey. The match was noted. There was money. At the time of his arrest, Frank Corey had in his possession a significant amount of cash. In the context of a man with his history and apparent circumstances, having a large roll of bills was notable. It was not May Price's money. There was no way to establish that definitively, but it was money, and it was there, and it was noted. And then there was Miss Jensen, who took the stand, who looked at Frank Corey across the courtroom, and who identified him as the large, rough man she had seen on the upper floors of the Hotel Hollis on the evening of the murder. The defense pushed back on all of it. The scratches could have come from anywhere. The cigarette brand was too common to be meaningful. The raincoat was a coincidence. The money was his own, legitimately earned. And Miss Jensen, the defense argued, was a woman who had seen a man briefly in a dim corridor and was now identifying someone specific based on an impression that was, by its nature, uncertain. What had she really seen? What could she really remember? The jury listened. They deliberated. And then they came back. Not guilty. Two words that struck Harvey like a physical blow. Not guilty. After everything, the months of investigation, the long hunt to Worcester, the careful assembly of evidence, the testimony of witnesses, the physical marks on May Price's body, and the matching marks on Corey's face. Not guilty. The courtroom was not silent when the verdict was read. There were sounds, sounds of disbelief, sounds of anger, sounds that didn't quite resolve into words, but that carried the full weight of the emotion in the room. Harvey was devastated. He did not perform his devastation in public. He was not the kind of man who performed anything. But those who knew him said that in the days after the verdict, he had the look of a man who has been asked a question he cannot answer. He believed Frank Corey had killed May Price. He believed it as firmly and as clearly as he believed anything. And a jury of 12 people had looked at the evidence and had decided that belief was not enough. Frank Corey walked out of that courthouse a free man. And Harvey stood and watched him go. But the story was not over. Harvey knew it was not over. Because somewhere in his understanding of this case, in the long months of living with it and thinking about it and refusing to let it go, he had developed a sense of how these things work, and something told him that the verdict was not the end. It was a setback. It was a terrible, maddening setback. But it was not the end. He was right. There are moments in any investigation where the story turns in a direction that no one could have anticipated, and those moments are usually not dramatic in the way that courtroom scenes are dramatic. They do not announce themselves with music or with sudden revelation. They arrive quietly, almost accidentally, in the form of something overheard or noticed or remembered at the wrong moment. And what happened to Frank Corey in the days after his acquittal was exactly that kind of moment, small, quiet, and completely decisive. Someone overheard a conversation. The details of what was said and who said it and exactly where they said it are, at this distance in time, somewhat blurred. The record is not as clear as investigators would have wished. But the substance of what was overheard was this. Frank Corey, in the aftermath of his acquittal, in the particular looseness that sometimes follows relief, had said something. He had been somewhere near the courthouse, or somewhere near a place associated with the courthouse, and he had been talking, and what he had said, or what the listener understood him to have said, contained information about his movements on or around the night of February 9th. Information that was new. Information that connected him, more specifically than anything the prosecution had been able to introduce at trial, to particular places and particular times. Harvey received this information carefully. He understood immediately that there was a problem, and that the problem was not a small one. Frank Corey had been tried for the murder of Mae Price, and had been acquitted. The principle of double jeopardy, the constitutional protection that prevents a person from being tried twice for the same crime, meant that he could not be tried for murder again. That door was closed, and closed permanently, and Harvey understood and accepted that. Whatever he personally believed about Frank Corey's guilt, the murder charge was finished. But the crime of February 9th, 1925 had not consisted only of murder. There had also been robbery. Nearly $200 had been taken from Mae Price's room. Those were two different crimes. And an acquittal on a murder charge did not automatically preclude a prosecution on a robbery charge arising from the same incident. If the prosecution could be structured carefully enough, and if the evidence was strong enough. Harvey and the district attorney's office began to examine this possibility with the same patient thoroughness that had characterized every other phase of the investigation. They needed to move carefully. They needed to build a case that could not be challenged on grounds of double jeopardy, a case that was genuinely about the robbery rather than a backdoor attempt to retry the murder. They needed new evidence, or old evidence newly understood, that was specific to the robbery and not merely a repetition of what had been argued at the murder trial. And they needed to do all of this without alerting Frank Corey, who was a man who had shown himself to be capable of disappearing when the need arose. While this work was being done quietly in the background, another opportunity presented itself. Frank Corey's history included a period of military service, or more accurately, a period of military absence. He had been in the army at some point, and he had deserted. Desertion was a federal offense, and it was a charge that had nothing to do with Mae Price or the Hotel Hollis or the events of February 1925. It was a clean charge, a separate charge, a charge that could be used to hold a man while other matters were being prepared. Harvey and his colleagues understood the utility of this. Corey was arrested again, this time on the desertion charge. He was not a free man in the way he had expected to remain a free man after his acquittal. He was back in custody, facing something different, something that he perhaps had not anticipated. And while he was being held on the desertion charge, the investigators were assembling the robbery case with a new urgency and a new precision. New evidence had been found, or rather, evidence that had existed but had not been fully developed at the time of the murder trial was now being developed more completely. A room at the Crawford House Annex, another hotel, a different location, had been connected to Corey during the relevant period, and a raincoat had been recovered there. The raincoat, the one that had been described. The one that connected the man seen in the Hollis to the man now sitting in custody. The raincoat, recovered from a different location, told a story of a man who had been moving through the city, staying in different places under different names, carrying a physical object that could be identified and traced. There was also a register. The Boston Tavern, another establishment connected to the period in question, had a record, a registration that bore a name, an alias, connected to Corey. Hotel registers in the 1920s were physical documents, handwritten, and they were the kind of evidence that could be brought into court and shown to a jury and pointed to with a degree of specificity that eyewitness testimony sometimes could not match. This name, written in this handwriting, in this register, on this date. That is something a jury can hold on to. The indictment was drawn up in secret. This mattered. A secret indictment meant that Corey did not know about the robbery charge until it was filed, which meant he could not prepare a specific defense in advance and could not take steps to deal with potential evidence or witnesses before they were secured. The element of surprise, in a legal context, is not always available, but when it is, it matters. And then there was a second trial. The second trial of Frank Corey was for robbery, not murder. The framing was different, the legal theory was different, and critically, the evidence was structured differently to address the specific question of the taking of May Price's money rather than the question of her death. The prosecution built its case around the new evidence, the Hanover Street room, the raincoat from the Crawford House Annex, the Boston Tavern register, and around a reconstructed timeline of Corey's movements that placed him in proximity to the Hotel Hollis with a specificity that the murder trial had not quite achieved. The defense, naturally, argued double jeopardy. The argument was that the robbery case was simply the murder case wearing different clothes, that prosecuting Corey for robbery arising from the same event as the murder of which he had been acquitted was an attempt to circumvent the constitutional protection against being tried twice for the same crime. This was a serious legal argument, and it was made by serious lawyers who understood what they were doing. The court considered it carefully. The appeal on double jeopardy grounds was denied. The trial proceeded. This time, the jury came back differently. Guilty. Frank Corey was convicted of robbery. He was sentenced to life imprisonment. The judge who pronounced the sentence, Judge Lowry, whose name appears in the record of this case with the particular clarity of someone who understood the weight of what they were doing, was not moved by the defense's arguments about the technical acquittal that had preceded this verdict. The jury had spoken. The evidence had been presented and evaluated. And the man who had checked into the Hotel Hollis under a false name, who had hidden in a room and waited, who had taken the money of a woman named May Price and had left her dead on the floor, was going to spend the rest of his life in prison. It was not the verdict that Harvey had wanted. He had wanted murder. He had wanted the full reckoning, the complete accounting, the justice that matched the crime in all its specific horror. What he got instead was a life sentence arrived at through a different door for a different charge, built on a reconstruction of events that everyone in that courtroom understood to be about more than just stolen money. The robbery conviction was, in the language of the law, genuinely separate from the murder acquittal. In the language of everything else, in the language of grief and justice and the memory of a woman who had been called mother by people who loved her, it was the closest thing to resolution that this case was going to offer. Frank Corey went to prison. He served his sentence. Whether he ever acknowledged what he had done to May Price is not recorded. Whether the investigators who had worked on the case for more than a year, who had followed his trail through New York and Worcester and demolished buildings and dead ends, who had finally caught him on a trolley in a Massachusetts city while pretending to care about sewer drainage, whether those men felt that justice had been done is also, ultimately, not recorded. What is recorded is the verdict and the sentence and the date they were pronounced. The rest is silence. But let's sit with May Price for a moment more, because the verdicts and the sentences and the legal maneuvering are the framework around a story that is actually about a person. A woman who got on trains and unloaded costume trunks and fixed hems at midnight and kept pay envelopes safe and listened to people's problems and made the difficult machinery of theatrical life run smoothly. A woman who had a husband who loved her and colleagues who called her mother. A woman who was planning to go home the next morning, who had her bags mostly packed, who was probably lying in her hotel room on the night of February 9th thinking about the train she was going to take and the cup of coffee she was going to have in the station and the ordinary life that was waiting for her in New York. She didn't make it home. Someone made sure of that. And the legal system, turning its slow gears, eventually put that someone away. Not for what he had done to her, not precisely, not in the terms that the charge of murder would have required, but away, in a cell, for the rest of his life. Was that justice? It is a question worth sitting with, and it is a question the story does not answer for us. The law answered it in its own way, in its own terms. But justice is not always the same thing as the law, and the law is not always the same thing as what actually happened. And what actually happened to May Price in room 406 of the Hotel Hollis on the night of February 9th, 1925, is something that exists in a space where no legal verdict can fully reach it. She fought back. Remember that. In the dark, alone, with her hands eventually bound, she fought back hard enough to leave marks on the person who killed her. She did not go quietly. She insisted on being there, on matching, on leaving evidence. And the evidence she left, the skin beneath her fingernails, the struggle that broke her ribs, was the evidence that ultimately led, through a long and tortuous path, to the life sentence that was the closest thing to justice this case produced. Let that breathe for a moment. She fought back, and 100 years later, we are still telling her story. There is something in that, if you look at it right. There is something that refuses to be merely sad. Now, I want to take you somewhere different for a moment. I want to take you away from Boston for a little while, away from the Hotel Hollis and the corridors and the courtrooms, and I want to bring you into the room where the investigators sat with what they knew and what they didn't know and the questions that lived in the space between them. Because there are things about this case that the official record doesn't answer. Things that have been sitting in that space for 100 years, turning slowly in the light like dust motes in a still room, neither settling nor rising. The first question, the one that haunts this story most persistently, is the question of how. How did Frank Corey, if it was Frank Corey, get out of room 406 when the door was found secured from the inside? The theory about hiding under the bed addresses the how of getting in. It does not address the how of getting out. And this is the gap that the record leaves carefully open, the gap that no one in the trial fully managed to close, that the defense exploited and the prosecution navigated around but never quite filled. Here is one possibility, offered gently and with the caveat that it is speculation. Hotel doors in 1925 were not the same as hotel doors today. The mechanisms were different. The locks were different. There were ways, in those old buildings with their old hardware, to manipulate a door from the outside so that it appeared to be secured from within. A skilled enough person, with the right knowledge and the right tool, might have been able to leave a room and arrange the locking mechanism in a way that would look, to the first person to try the door, as though it had been locked from inside. Whether Frank Corey had this knowledge and this skill is not established by any evidence in the record, but it is consistent with a man who had, among his various accomplishments, once escaped from Leavenworth through a sewer pipe. The second question is the question of knowledge. How did whoever committed this crime know that May Price was carrying money? The pay envelopes were not common knowledge outside the company. The specific amounts she was carrying were not the kind of information that circulated widely. Yet the robbery had been, apparently, targeted. May Price had been targeted rather than another guest at the hotel, and the money had been the specific thing taken. How? One possibility is that it was not targeted at all. That the killer chose room 406 for reasons that had nothing to do with knowing May Price was carrying money. Perhaps because it was on the 4th floor and accessible. Perhaps because the room had been observed to be occupied by a woman traveling alone. Perhaps simply because it was the room he had decided on. And the money was discovered in the course of what happened, and taken because it was there. This possibility makes the crime feel more random and perhaps more terrifying. Not planned against May Price specifically, but planned against some woman in some room, and May Price happened to be the one. Another possibility is that someone in or around the theatrical world had passed information, had mentioned, even casually, that the wardrobe mistress of the Brown Derby Company was responsible for the company's payroll during the Boston engagement. In a city like Boston in 1925, where the boundaries between the legitimate world and the underworld were porous in ways that Prohibition had made even more porous, information traveled in unexpected channels. A conversation in a bar, a word dropped in passing, a connection between someone who knew the company and someone who knew Frank Corey or people like him. It is possible. It is unprovable, but it is possible. The third question is the question of the birthday party in room 606. This is the most specific and in some ways the most troubling of the unanswered questions, because it suggests premeditation of a particular kind. The key to room 606 was taken during a party. Someone was at or near that party, or had access to the corridor where the party was happening, and took the key. The people who were at the party were theater people, guests of the hotel. The person who took the key was apparently not among them. Or if they were there in a capacity that no one subsequently remembered or reported. A stranger at a party, or someone who had moved through the corridor while the door stood open, the key visible and accessible, and had taken it without being noticed. Either way, it was deliberate. A hotel room key is not something that you pick up accidentally. You pick it up because you want it, because you have a use for it, because you are planning something for which a hotel room key will be useful. And then you go and do the thing you were planning. These questions, the door, the knowledge, the key, are the open spaces in this story. They are where the official record ends and the imagination begins. And in a story that is already more than 90 years old, the imagination is all we have left to fill those spaces with. What we can say with confidence is this. A woman named Mae Price was murdered in the Hotel Hollis in Boston on the night of February 9th, 1925. A man named Frank Corey, who had been in the hotel under a false name in the days before the murder, was identified by witnesses connected to the hotel and tried for murder. He was acquitted. He was subsequently convicted of robbery and sentenced to life imprisonment. The investigation was long and difficult and was sustained, when it might otherwise have collapsed, by the persistence of a single investigator who refused to let it go. And that investigator, Sergeant Thomas Harvey, is in some ways the real protagonist of this story. Not the most dramatic figure, not the most theatrical, but the most important. The one who kept the file on his desk when everyone else had moved on. The one who kept asking questions in places where questions were uncomfortable. The one who, when the system failed and the jury returned the wrong verdict, did not give up, but began immediately to think about what else could be done. What other door might open? What other angle might work? Persistence is not glamorous. It does not make for the most exciting narrative. It is not the sudden breakthrough, the clever deduction, the moment of forensic revelation. It is just showing up, every day, and continuing. It is the accumulated weight of not stopping. And in this case, that accumulated weight was what finally put Frank Corey in a prison cell for the rest of his life. Mae Price deserved a murder conviction. She deserved the full reckoning of the law for what was done to her. She got a robbery conviction instead, and a life sentence for the man who took from her not just her money, but everything. It is not the resolution that should have come, but it is the one that came. And in the space between what should have happened and what did happen, the story of the Hotel Hollis mystery lives on, asking its questions, refusing to fully settle, turning slowly in the light. If you are still here, my sleepy friends, I want you to know something. You just spent time with a woman named Mae Price. You heard her story. You learned who she was, not just a victim in a case file, but a person who made people's lives better, who was trusted with their money and their problems, who was called mother because she earned it. You honored her by listening. That matters. Every story told about her is a small resistance against forgetting. Take a slow breath. You are safe. You are home. The darkness outside your window is just the night, ordinary and quiet. The sounds around you are familiar. You are here, and you are fine. Rest a little while I take you gently to the next story, the next set of questions, the next life that deserves to be remembered. There is a quality to the night that changes after midnight. You may have noticed this if you have ever been awake at 2 or 3 in the morning, not because you couldn't sleep, but because something kept you there, some task or thought or worry that refused to let go until the small hours had passed. The quality of the silence changes. The darkness seems to have more texture to it, more weight. And the thoughts you have in those hours are different from daytime thoughts, more honest, sometimes more willing to go to places that the light of day tends to push away. I want to talk about that quality of the night as it relates to what happened at the Hotel Hollis, because I think it is something that the official record, with its dates and times and legal terminology, does not quite capture. What happened there happened in the deep night, in those particular hours when the city had gone as quiet as it was going to get, and the hotel had settled into sleep, and the only sounds were the small mechanical sounds of a building doing what buildings do in the cold. It happened in the dark, in the silence. And that darkness and that silence are part of the story in a way that matters. Think about what it means to be in a hotel room alone at 2 in the morning. You are at your most vulnerable, in some sense. You are in an unfamiliar space, without the familiar objects and sounds of home, in the private state of near sleep or sleep itself, with your guard as far down as it ever goes. And what happened to May Price happened in exactly that state, in exactly that hour, in a room where she should have been completely safe. Hotels are interesting places. They are public spaces that contain private spaces, buildings full of strangers sharing walls and floors, and the same stairways, and the same corridors, each in their own pocket of privacy, each separate from all the others. And in that configuration, there is a peculiar kind of vulnerability that doesn't exist in a private home. The vulnerability of being one of many, of being surrounded by people you don't know, of trusting the institution of the hotel itself to maintain the boundary between your private space and the rest of the world. May Price trusted the Hotel Hollis to maintain that boundary. She had stayed there before. She knew the building and the staff and the particular feel of the place. She was not a naive traveler. She was a woman who had spent years moving through hotels and train stations and unfamiliar cities, and she had developed the practical wisdom that comes from that kind of experience. She would have locked her door. She would have checked the windows. She would have taken the reasonable precautions that a careful, experienced traveler takes. And none of it was enough. Because the person who meant her harm was not coming from outside the boundary. They were already inside it, already within the protected space, already there in the room when she arrived. This is the part of the theory that I find most difficult to sit with, and I mention it not to frighten you, but because I think it is essential to understanding what this case was really about. If the under-the-bed theory is correct, and the evidence, while circumstantial, points in that direction, then what happened was premeditated in a very specific and very cold way. A person decided to hide. A person got into the room, somehow, and got under the bed, and waited. They waited for May Price to come back. They waited for the floor to quiet and the hotel to sleep. They waited with whatever they intended to do already formed and decided in their mind. And when the moment came, they acted. That kind of patience, that cold, deliberate patience, is what distinguishes this crime from a simple robbery or even a robbery gone wrong. A robbery gone wrong is chaotic. It is the product of bad decisions made in the moment, of surprise and panic and things escalating in ways no one planned. What happened in room 406 was not chaotic. It was controlled. It was planned. May Price fought back, and she fought with everything she had, but the person doing this to her did not panic and run. They continued. They completed what they came to do. And then they arranged the door and they left. I am telling you this not to dwell in the darkness of it, but because understanding the nature of a crime is part of understanding the nature of justice. And the justice that came in this case, a robbery conviction, a life sentence for a charge that was technically not what this was, is perhaps the most honest reflection of what the law could do and what it couldn't. The law could build a case for robbery. It could not, in the end, build a case for murder that survived the jury. And so it used what it had. And what it had was enough to put Frank Corey in a cell for the rest of his life, which is, imperfectly, through a side door, with all the frustrations of a system that is built for process and sometimes loses sight of truth, something. Let me tell you about something else that has always struck me about this case. It is the way the theatrical world intersected with the crime world in that particular period, in that particular city, in 1925. These two worlds, the world of vaudeville and theater and traveling companies and wardrobe trunks and audiences and applause, and the world of petty crime and organized violence and men who move through the city under false names carrying secrets. These worlds were not as separate as you might expect. The theater district of Boston in the 1920s was surrounded by the kinds of neighborhoods that harbored both. The saloons and the rooming houses and the streets where a man like Frank Corey could move without attracting attention were adjacent to the theaters where the Brown Derby Company performed. The guests of the Hotel Hollis, both the theatrical guests and the transient criminals passing through under assumed names, moved through the same corridors, ate in the same dining room, passed through the same lobby. The proximity was physical and almost casual, and it meant that information, like money, could travel between these worlds without much friction. A man asking questions in a bar near the theater district about traveling companies. A man watching the hotel from the street, counting the guests, noting who came in and who went out and what they carried. A man who had been in the building for several days, quietly observing, before he took a room and began his particular kind of preparation. Frank Corey had been at the Hotel Hollis for a reason, and the reason was intelligence, the gathering of information about the place and its occupants and its routines that would allow him to do what he intended to do. This is the kind of crime that requires a certain kind of mind, not an unintelligent mind, quite the opposite. The planning involved, the patience, the execution, these are not the marks of someone who acts on impulse. And this is perhaps the most disturbing element of the Hotel Hollis mystery, if you are willing to follow it to its end. The murder of Mae Price was not a crime of passion. It was not even, purely, a crime of desperation. It was, in the cold language of criminal psychology, a predatory crime. The selection of a target, the preparation of a method, the execution of a plan. The plan went wrong in one sense. Mae Price fought back in a way that left marks. The plan succeeded in another sense. The killer got out of the hotel without being seen, without leaving fingerprints or other clean evidence, without attracting the attention of any staff or other guests who might have been able to identify them with certainty in the moment rather than through photographs weeks later. But the plan also failed in the longest sense. It failed because Mae Price fought back, because she left marks, because she insisted, in the only way available to her, on being remembered. And she was remembered by Harvey, who kept her file on his desk, and by the witnesses who identified her killer, and by the prosecutors who built a second case when the first one failed, and by the judge who sentenced a guilty man to life imprisonment for a crime that was, in legal terms, a robbery, even if everyone in that courtroom understood it was something else. And now, 100 years later, she is remembered here too. In this quiet, wherever you are listening from, in the particular kind of attention that is available in the dark and the stillness. You are paying attention to Mae Price. You are holding her in mind. And that is not nothing. Breathe softly. Let your muscles rest. The story is still going. And I will keep the pace slow, and I will keep your hand in mine as we move through it. If you want to understand why the Hotel Hollis case became the case that it became, the case that outlasted its formal resolution, that continued to be discussed and examined long after Frank Corey had been sentenced and the courtroom had gone quiet, you have to understand something about the nature of unanswered questions and the human need to find answers for them. This is true of all true crime, in a sense. The reason people listen to stories like this one, in the dark, in the quiet hours, is not purely because they are frightening or exciting, though they may be both. It is because they are incomplete. A solved mystery is satisfying. An unsolved one is compelling. And a mystery that is technically resolved, but genuinely unsatisfying, a mystery that has a verdict but not quite an answer, is the most compelling kind of all. The Hotel Hollis case was technically resolved. A man was convicted of robbery and sentenced to life imprisonment in connection with the death of Mae Price. That is a resolution. But the murder charge had failed, and the conviction that came was for a lesser crime, and the questions that remained, the questions about the locked door, the hidden killer, the key from room 606, the knowledge of the money. Those questions had never been answered in court, never established as fact, only offered as theory. And in the space those unanswered questions created, the story lived on. There is also something compelling about the character of Sergeant Thomas Harvey. I want to spend a little more time with him, because I think he deserves it. He was not a famous man. He was not the kind of investigator whose name became synonymous with brilliant cases or legendary deductions. He was a working detective in a city police department, doing the daily grinding work of investigation with the resources he had and the time he was given. And when the resources were withdrawn and the time ran out and the department had moved on to other things, he kept working. Not because he was heroic in any theatrical sense, but because he was persistent in the most ordinary and most admirable sense. Persistence is underrated. We celebrate cleverness and brilliance and the sudden insight, the moment of deduction that cracks a case open. These things are real and they matter. But the Hotel Hollis case was not solved by a moment of brilliance. It was solved, to the extent that it was solved, by someone who kept a file on his desk and kept asking questions and refused to let the passage of time be an acceptable reason to stop. That is a particular kind of dedication that is quiet and unglamorous and absolutely essential. Think about what Harvey did in the months between the discovery of the crime and the development of the lead that gave him Frank Corey's name. He did the work. Every day, in whatever margin of time he could find, he did the work. He reread the statements. He re-examined the physical evidence. He kept his lines of communication open with informants and contacts in the parts of the city where useful information circulated. He maintained the case in a state of active attention even when there was nothing active happening. He watered it. In a sense, the way you water a plant that appears dormant but that you believe, on some level of faith, is still alive. And the plant grew. Not dramatically, not all at once, but eventually it grew. The name surfaced. The photograph arrived. The witnesses identified it. The trail led to Worcester, and the trolley, and the quiet arrest, and the interrogation room, and the trial, and the acquittal, and then the second trial, and the conviction. All of that came from keeping the file on the desk. All of that came from not stopping. This, I think, is the deepest theme of the Hotel Hollis case, more than justice or forensics or the particular cruelty of the crime. It is about what happens when a single person decides that something matters enough to persist. Harvey could have closed the file. The department had, in effect, asked him to. Other cases were pressing. Other victims needed attention. The institutional logic of the situation was entirely on the side of letting the Hotel Hollis murder become one of those unsolved cases that fill the filing cabinets of every police department in the country. Harvey declined to let it be that. And because of that, Frank Corey spent the rest of his life in prison. That is what persistence does when it is applied to the right purpose by the right person at the right time. Now, let me tell you something else about 1925 Boston that is important to understand if you want to feel the full texture of this story. It was a city in the middle of a strange and contradictory period. Prohibition was in effect, which meant that alcohol was illegal, which meant that alcohol was everywhere, in the speakeasies and the back rooms, and the carefully private social events where the rules were well understood to not apply. The energy of that contradiction, of a law that almost everyone broke and almost no one respected, had a particular effect on the culture of cities like Boston. It created a widespread sense that the line between legal and illegal was negotiable, that the right connections and the right arrangements could put almost anything within reach. This is the atmosphere in which Frank Corey moved. He was not unusual in moving through the borderlands between the legitimate world and the criminal one. Many people did, in that era, in that city. What made him unusual was the particular character of the crimes he committed. He was not a bootlegger or a numbers man or a small-time hustler. He was violent in a way that was different from the ordinary commerce of the underworld. He was, in the language that Benny Peretti had used, a guerrilla, a man whose value to anyone who might employ him lay in his capacity to hurt people. And when there was no one to employ him, he applied that capacity on his own account. The Leavenworth file told the story of a man who had been violent in multiple contexts, over multiple years, in multiple states. Frank Corey had not appeared in Boston and committed his first crime. He had arrived with a history, with a set of developed skills and an established willingness to use them, and he had found in the Hotel Hollis and in the Brown Derby Company's payroll a target that suited his purposes. Whether he chose May Price's room because he knew she had money or because she had the room that was most accessible to whatever preparation he had done, that question, as I said earlier, remains open. But the choosing was deliberate. The preparation was deliberate. The crime was deliberate. And this is where the psychological dimension of the case becomes interesting and slightly haunting. A man who hides under a bed and waits for hours in the dark is operating with a kind of discipline that is frightening precisely because it is controlled. He is not carried away by emotion. He is not acting on impulse. He is managing himself, his breathing, his body, his presence, in a space so confined that most people would panic, for a period so long that most people would give up, toward a goal so specific that any deviation from the plan would require him to recalibrate and continue. That is control. And control, when it is in the service of something terrible, is more disturbing than chaos. The investigators who eventually built the case against Frank Corey understood this. They understood that they were dealing with someone who had planned, and who would plan again, and who would continue to plan if he was not stopped. The urgency of the case, the urgency that Harvey maintained even when the department had moved on, was partly about justice for May Price and partly about something more broadly protective. A man like this, free in the city, was a specific and ongoing danger. Not in the abstract, threatening way that statistics sometimes describe danger, but in the specific and immediate way of a person who has done something terrible once and has demonstrated the capacity and the willingness to do it again. The life sentence, when it came, addressed this. Whatever the charge and whatever the legal pathway, the sentence meant that Frank Corey would not be planning anything in any hotel room for the foreseeable future. The city of Boston, and every city in the country, was safer. It was a practical outcome, if not a fully satisfying one. I want to linger for a moment in a particular image from this case, one that I find striking and somewhat poignant. The image of Thomas Harvey at his desk, late in the evening, with the Hotel Hollis file in front of him, in the period when the case had gone cold and most of his colleagues had moved on. I imagine, and this is imagination, not history, that there was a quality of stillness to those moments. The department around him quieting as the shift changed, the sounds of the city coming in through the windows, the particular feeling of being with a question that doesn't yet have an answer. He would have looked at the photographs, the crime scene photos, the photograph from Leavenworth, the photographs of the hotel that the investigators had taken early in the case. He would have reread the statements. He would have gone back to Dr. Leary's report, back to the detail about the skin under the fingernails, back to the cigarette, back to the key. He would have felt, probably, the frustration of someone who can see the shape of something without quite being able to make it solid enough to hold. And then, on whatever evening it was, on whatever occasion, he would have set the file aside and gone home, and come back the next day and begun again. Because that is what persistence looks like from the inside. Not dramatic, not elegant, just showing up and continuing. That image, Harvey at his desk, with the file, in the quiet, feels like the heart of the Hotel Hollis case in a way that the courtroom scenes don't quite manage to be. The trial had all the drama and all the formal resolution. But this was where the case was really kept alive. This desk, this man, this quiet. Let us move, for a moment, away from the specific and into the general. Or rather, let us move from the specific case into the specific time, because the time matters here in ways that are worth understanding. 1925 America was a country in a particular kind of motion. The 20s were roaring, as the saying goes, but the roaring was not uniform. It was loud in some places and nearly silent in others. It was a boom in the cities and a struggle in the countryside. It was the gleaming chrome and glass of the new automobile culture and the dirt roads and the drought that was beginning to creep into the agricultural heartland. It was prosperity for some and poverty for many, and the particular American talent for looking at both and seeing only the prosperity. The theatrical world that Mae Price inhabited was part of the boom. Vaudeville and theater were enormously popular in this period, before the coming of sound film would eventually hollow them out. And traveling companies like the Brown Derby Company moved through cities large and small, selling the particular pleasure of live performance to audiences who dressed up for it, and came in from surrounding towns for it, and thought of it as one of the genuine pleasures of life. The theatrical world had its own economy, its own social hierarchy, its own geography of cities and routes and connections. Mae Price lived inside this world with the comfort of someone for whom it had become entirely natural. But she was also a woman traveling alone in a city that was not entirely safe. This is not a condition unique to 1925, of course. It is a condition that has been constant in ways that are depressing to think about. But the specific character of the danger in 1925 Boston was shaped by specific forces, prohibition, which had created an extensive criminal infrastructure, the particular demographics of the hotel district, which placed theatrical travelers in proximity to transient populations that included people with criminal histories, and the forensic limitations of the era, which meant that criminals operated with a reasonable confidence that their work would be difficult to prove. Frank Corey had operated in this environment for years before he came to the Hotel Hollis. He had moved through the criminal world with the practiced ease of someone who understood its geography and its norms and its protections. He had served time in Leavenworth and had escaped, and had continued, had accumulated aliases, and had learned how to check into hotels under false names, and how to move through cities without being noticed by anyone who would later be able to remember him clearly. He was good at not being seen, except in the moments when he was seen, by Miss Jensen, on the upper floor of the hotel, looking at her with the quality that made her turn around and leave. That moment, Miss Jensen seeing him, being frightened, leaving, is one of the pivots of this story. If she had not been frightened, if she had stopped and spoken to him, if she had simply passed him in the corridor without noting anything particular. The investigation that eventually led to Frank Corey's conviction depended, in part, on her memory of that encounter, her willingness to report it, and her ability to identify the man in a photograph weeks and months later. Her testimony in the first trial, while not enough to convict on murder, was part of the web of identification that gave the case its coherence. Without her, the shape of the case would have been different. This is another quiet theme of this story, the importance of the people who remember. Miss Jensen remembered. The hotel clerk remembered. Vinnie Peretti remembered, or knew, and chose to share that knowledge with someone who could use it. These acts of remembering and sharing are small and human and unglamorous, but without them, the story ends differently. Without them, Frank Corey might have remained a shadow, a man the investigators suspected but could not reach, a presence at the edges of the case that could never be brought into the center. They brought him into the center because enough people remembered enough things. And they held him there through 2 trials and a life sentence because the investigators and the prosecutors used those memories carefully, built on them, found the physical evidence that gave them context and weight, and refused to give up when the first attempt to hold him accountable failed. The acquittal on the murder charge was, and I say this carefully, because I do not want to suggest anything about the specific jurors who made that decision. People who had their reasons and their standards, and who were operating within a system designed to make conviction difficult. The acquittal was a blow. But it was also, in a strange way, an invitation. An invitation to think differently about what evidence existed and what charges it might support, and what could be built on a different framework. The prosecutors took that invitation seriously. The secret indictment for robbery was the result of that seriousness. It required a willingness to go back to the beginning, to re-examine what was known, to identify what new evidence had come to light, to think about the legal structure of a second case in a way that honored both the constitutional protection against double jeopardy and the practical need to hold a guilty man accountable for something. It was careful work. It was creative work in the best sense. Creative not as artistic expression, but as problem solving, as finding a path through a system that had placed an obstacle in the most direct way. And the path they found worked. It worked legally. The appeal on double jeopardy grounds failed. It worked evidentially. The new material about the Hanover Street room and the raincoat and the Boston Tavern Register added substance to what had already been established. And it worked in terms of outcome. Frank Corey was convicted and sentenced to life imprisonment. This is the resolution the law offered. It is imperfect, as I have said. It is the right result achieved by a sideways method for a crime that was more serious than the charge acknowledged. But let me make an argument for it, gently, without claiming more than the facts warrant. A life sentence is a life sentence. Whether it is imposed for murder or for robbery, the person serving it does not get to walk out of prison. Frank Corey, convicted of robbery, sentenced to life, spent the rest of his life in custody. The crime he committed, the murder of May Price in room 406 of the Hotel Hollis, was never forgotten by the people who knew it. It was not resolved, in the formal sense, by the verdict on the robbery charge. The verdict did not say guilty of murder. It said guilty of robbery, and everyone in that courtroom understood what it meant. There is a concept in law of pleasing the spirit of justice even when the letter of justice requires a detour. The Hotel Hollis case is a good example of this. The spirit of justice demanded that Frank Corey spend the rest of his life in prison for what he did to May Price. The letter of justice, after the acquittal on the murder charge, required a different path to that outcome. The prosecutors found that path. Harvey supported them. The judge imposed the appropriate sentence. And the outcome, life imprisonment, matched the spirit, even if the path to it was unconventional. Is that enough? I put the question to you not because I have an answer, but because it is worth asking. When the system produces the right result through an imperfect mechanism, is that the same as justice? When the technical charge is lesser than the crime, but the sentence is no lesser, has justice been done in any meaningful sense? These are questions that philosophers and lawyers have argued about for centuries, and the Hotel Hollis case provides a real and specific example of the argument that is more useful than any hypothetical. My answer, for what it is worth, is that justice is not a single thing. It is a collection of things: the punishment of the guilty, the vindication of the victim, the protection of the public, the maintenance of the principles of law. In the case of Frank Corey and May Price, some of those things happened and some of them didn't, and the ones that happened were enough to constitute something that deserves to be called justice, even if it is imperfect justice, even if it arrived through an unconventional door. May Price was not forgotten. Her killer was not free. He was not in a position to hurt anyone else. And the people who worked to achieve these outcomes, Harvey, the prosecutors, the witnesses who testified, the judge who sentenced, all of them brought their best efforts to a situation that was genuinely difficult, and they produced a result that was genuinely meaningful. That is something. In a world where genuine justice is hard to come by, where cases go cold and killers walk free and families wait forever for resolutions that never come, the Hotel Hollis case, imperfect as it is, stands as a story in which persistence and careful work eventually produced an outcome that mattered. A guilty man went to prison. A woman who was called mother by people who loved her was remembered and her story told. The record was made, and the record endured. Let that be enough for now. Let that be the thing you carry with you as your eyes grow heavy and the sounds of the night settle around you. Something happened in Boston 100 years ago, and it mattered, and it was not forgotten. That is not the whole of the story, but it is the most important part. I want to tell you now about the world of vaudeville and theatrical travel in the 1920s, not as a digression from the story, but as an essential part of its texture. Because May Price's life, before the night of February 9th, 1925, was a life of movement and connection and the particular intimacy that forms between people who share the unusual experience of being part of a traveling company. Vaudeville was at its peak in this period. The circuit system, the Orpheum Circuit, the Keith Albee Circuit, and others, moved performers and companies through cities all across the country with the organizational efficiency of a very complex machine. Theaters in every city of reasonable size booked performers on rotating schedules, and the performers traveled between them on trains, carrying their trunks and their costumes and their habits and their superstitions and the small portable comforts that help human beings feel at home in unfamiliar places. It was a life that required a particular kind of temperament, adaptable, resilient, social, able to form deep connections quickly and then leave them when the schedule demanded. May Price had that temperament in abundance. She had been doing this work long enough that the rhythms of it were her rhythms. The loading and unloading, the hotels and the trains, the theaters in city after city with their particular smells and their particular backstage configurations and their particular lighting. She knew which theaters had good green rooms and which made you share a dressing room the size of a closet with 6 other people. She knew which hotels served a decent breakfast and which charged too much for not enough. She knew the train schedules by heart, not from studying them, but from having lived them. And she knew people. This is perhaps the most important thing about May Price's world. It was a world of people, dense and interconnected and warm in the way that worlds built around performance and mutual dependence tend to be warm. The members of the Brown Derby Company were her people. Not her blood family. She had Bill in New York for that. But her working family, the people with whom she shared the daily reality of theatrical life, the long days and the short nights, and the particular exhilaration of a show that's going well and the particular despair of one that isn't. They trusted her with money. I keep coming back to this, and I do it deliberately, because I think it is the most precise summary of what May Price was and how she was regarded. You don't give someone your money unless you trust them completely. You don't leave your pay envelope in someone else's hands unless you have watched that person for long enough and closely enough to be certain that they will keep it safe. The members of the Brown Derby Company had done that watching, and they had arrived at certainty, and they gave her their money. And she kept it safe, in the way she kept everything safe, until the night that a man she had never met decided that what was hers should be his. There is an injustice in that, beyond the obvious injustice of the murder. The injustice of trust betrayed, not by someone she trusted, but by someone who targeted her precisely because she was trustworthy. Because her trustworthiness made her the one who carried the money, and the money was what he was after. Her virtue, in this specific sense, made her a target. And that is a particular kind of cruelty that deserves to be named. In the days after the murder, the Brown Derby Company did something that speaks to who they were as a community. They did not simply leave Boston. They could not leave Boston immediately. The police needed them for questioning, and there were practical matters that had to be attended to. But in those days, in the disruption and the grief of what had happened, They took care of each other. They sat with each other. They talked. They remembered May Price together. In the way that people who are far from home and in the middle of something terrible have always found ways to process the unprocessable through the simple human act of being together and speaking and listening. The investigators who spoke to them in the days after the murder noted the cohesion of the group, the way they supported each other, the genuine grief that was visible and consistent across all the interviews. This was not the performance of grief, not the theatrical version, which would have been available to these performers if they had chosen it, but the real thing, unmanaged and uncontrolled, the particular rawness of people who have lost someone that mattered. It mattered to the investigation in one specific way. The unanimity of the portrait of May Price that emerged from those interviews told the investigators clearly that whatever had happened to her, it had not come from within the company. It had come from outside. The motive was not personal grievance or professional jealousy or any of the internal dynamics that sometimes generate tragedy in close-knit communities. The motive was, almost certainly, the money, and the money pointed outward, towards someone who had knowledge of it and had come to the hotel specifically to take it. This is what focused the investigation on the Hotel Hollis itself, on who had been in the building, on who had access to the floors, on who might have been watching the company during their Boston engagement. And that focus eventually led to the desk clerk's recollection of Frank Muliono, and to the connection between Muliono and Frank Corey, and to the photograph from Leavenworth. It all connected. It connected slowly and imperfectly, and with many wrong turns and dead ends along the way, but it connected. And at the center of the connection was May Price herself, her routines, her responsibilities, her trustworthiness, the particular shape of her life that had made her, in the tragic mathematics of this crime, a target. Let me take you now to a quieter place within this story. Let me take you to the question of what the investigators did not find, because the absences are as telling as the presences in a case like this. They did not find the money. The $200, or approximately that amount, that May Price was carrying was never recovered. In the trial, the big roll of bills found in Frank Corey's possession at the time of his arrest was noted, but it could not be definitively identified as May Price's money. Money is not individuated the way physical objects are. Bills do not carry serial numbers that were recorded at the time of distribution in a 1920s traveling theatrical company. The money was gone, and it stayed gone, and its specific fate, spent, hidden, distributed, was never established. They did not find the key from room 606. This key, which had been taken from the birthday party, was never recovered. Whether it was discarded by the killer after use, whether it was lost, whether it remained somewhere in the physical world, in a drain or a trash receptacle or the bottom of a pocket in a coat that was later thrown away, is unknown. Its absence is significant because it means that the mechanism by which the killer may have moved through the hotel cannot be definitively established. The theory holds, but the physical evidence for that specific element of the theory is absent. They did not find any witness to the moment of the crime itself. No one saw anything. No one heard anything. The walls of the Hotel Hollis maintained their silence throughout the night of February 9th, and no guest or staff member could say with any clarity what had happened on the fourth floor between the hours of midnight and dawn. The crime existed in a bubble of the unseen and the unheard, which is exactly what its perpetrator had planned for. These absences are frustrating, but they are also instructive. They tell us that Frank Corey, if it was Frank Corey, which the evidence strongly suggests, was skilled at what he did. He left almost nothing. Almost. He left a dropped cigarette and the marks on May Price's hands, and the citing by Miss Jensen, and the memory of the hotel clerk, and the name in the register, and the raincoat at the Crawford House Annex, and the record at Leavenworth. He left almost nothing, but almost nothing was enough. Barely enough. Enough, through long work and careful assembly, to put him in a cell for the rest of his life. And there is something satisfying in that, in the particular satisfaction of a thing that almost didn't work, but did. The case that almost went cold. The investigator who almost gave up. The prosecution that found a way where there seemed to be no way. The conviction that came through a back door because the front door had been closed. All of these almosts, stacked on top of each other, amount to something that is not quite triumph, but is more than failure. It is the kind of outcome that happens in real life, as opposed to stories. And that is perhaps why it feels true in a way that neater resolutions don't always manage. Real justice is messy and slow and full of detours and near misses and imperfect outcomes. In this case, 100 years old and full of its own imperfections, is a very real story of very real justice in all its messiness. You are safe, my sleepy friends. You are in your bed, or your chair, or wherever you have found to be comfortable tonight, and the sounds around you are familiar, and the night is ordinary. Let the story settle into you gently. Let it be what it is, a memory of something difficult that ended, eventually, as well as it could. Let your breathing slow. There is one more figure in this story that I have not spent enough time with, and I want to remedy that now. I want to talk about Miss May Jensen. She had been having an ordinary evening. Whatever she had done before the encounter in the corridor, whether she had been to dinner, or to a performance, or visiting with friends in the hotel, she was moving through the hotel on her own business, a professional woman, comfortable in the environment of theatrical hotels, not expecting anything unusual. And then she turned a corner, or she stepped into a corridor, and there was a man. She described him later, in the careful language that witnesses use when they are trying to be precise about something they experienced briefly and under conditions of stress: large, rough, out of place. She did not mean out of place in the sense of obviously conspicuous. A man who was obviously conspicuous would not have lasted long in a hotel corridor. She meant out of place in a subtler sense, the kind of wrongness that the body registers before the mind catches up to it. Something about the quality of his attention. Something about the way he occupied the space. Something that made her skin understand, before her brain articulated it, that she should not be here. She left. She backed away and turned and left, and she felt, as people often do in these moments, a mixture of relief and foolishness. Relief at the distance she was putting between herself and whatever had unnerved her. Foolishness at the reaction itself, at the feeling that she might be overreacting to the presence of a perfectly ordinary man in a perfectly ordinary corridor. And then the next morning arrived, and the news arrived with it, and she understood that she had not been overreacting at all. Miss Jensen came forward with her account of the corridor encounter because she understood immediately that it was relevant. She was a professional woman with good judgment and a clear memory, and she understood what she had seen in a new light when the context changed around it. She went to the investigators, and she told them what she had seen, and she described it as precisely as she could, and she submitted to the photographs. Looking at the photographs they brought her, one by one or in groups, until she came to one that stopped her. Frank Corey's photograph from Leavenworth. She looked at it. She sat with it for the moment that careful witnesses sit with photographs when they are trying to be honest. And she said yes. This is the weight that Miss Jensen carried from that morning forward. The certainty, or the close enough to certainty that a good faith identification represents, that the man she had seen in the corridor was the man in the photograph, was the man who had gone to room 406 that night and done what he had done. She carried that certainty through the first trial, where she testified and where her identification was challenged and where the jury ultimately decided it was not enough. She carried it through the period of the acquittal, when Frank Corey walked out of the courthouse a free man, and she had to live with the knowledge that she had done everything right, and it had not been enough. What that feels like, to have told the truth and done your duty, and then watch the system fail to act on what you told it, is something that is difficult to describe to someone who hasn't experienced it. It is a particular kind of helplessness, the helplessness of having done everything correctly and watching the outcome be wrong anyway. And it is compounded by the fact that the person who did the wrong thing is now free, is back in the world, is moving through the streets under their own power with a legal acquittal in their pocket. Miss Jensen did not stop being a witness after the first trial. She remained part of the record. And when the second trial came, when the robbery case was built and the secret indictment was filed and Frank Corey was in custody again, she was still there, a witness whose testimony had not changed, whose identification had not wavered, who had been right the first time and remained right the second time. In this particular story, with all its complications and detours and imperfect resolutions, Miss May Jensen is one of the clearest moral examples. She saw something. She was frightened by it. The next morning, she understood why, and she told the truth about it, consistently and under challenge, through 2 trials and everything in between. That is not dramatic. It is not the stuff of action sequences or sudden revelations. It is just a person doing the right thing when it would have been easier to stay quiet. when it would have been understandable to say that she wasn't sure, that she couldn't really be certain, that the corridor had been dim and the encounter brief, and the memory possibly unreliable. She didn't say that. She said what she knew and what she had seen, and she kept saying it. And it mattered. It was part of what mattered. One thread in a web, but a thread that held. I find myself thinking about what it would have been like to be Miss Jensen in the days and weeks after the murder, before the investigation produced anything solid. She had seen the man. She had reported it. And then there was nothing she could do but wait and see if what she had reported would turn into something. She went on with her life, presumably, performed her shows, traveled on to other cities, did the work of being a vaudeville actress in the mid-1920s. And somewhere under all of that, she carried the image of a large, rough man in a corridor and the knowledge of what had happened to the woman on the 4th floor. She was not alone in carrying this, of course. All the members of the Brown Derby Company carried it. The hotel staff carried it. Thomas Harvey carried it, in the specific way of an investigator whose case has gone cold. The city of Boston carried it, in the vague collective way that cities carry their unsolved crimes, present but not quite visible, part of the background rather than the foreground. When the case eventually broke, when Frank Corey was arrested and charged and tried, there must have been something like relief in all of those people. The relief of a name. The relief of a face attached to the shadow that had been moving through the background of the story for so long. Even the relief of an acquittal, in a strange way, because an acquittal means that the name was named and the face was shown and the system had engaged with the question, even if its answer was unsatisfying. The mystery, while not resolved, had been narrowed. There was now a specific person who was the center of the remaining questions, rather than a faceless unknown. And then the robbery conviction provided a different kind of relief, the relief of consequence, of the machinery of justice having produced, through whatever imperfect path, an outcome that matched the reality of what had happened. Frank Corey was in prison. He would remain in prison. And the people who had been carrying the story, Miss Jensen, the hotel staff, the members of the company, Thomas Harvey, could set down, if not the weight of the loss, at least the weight of the unresolved. It had resolved. Imperfectly, slowly, through detours, but it had resolved. The night of February 9th, 1925, had finally come to something that could be called an ending. But endings in true crime are not always endings in the way that stories end. The official record closes and the sentence is pronounced, and the courtroom empties and the journalists write their final pieces, and the case moves from active to archived. But the people who lived it keep living. May Price's husband Bill went on, without her. The members of the company went on. Thomas Harvey went on, presumably to other cases, other files, other periods of patient attention waiting for something to surface. Miss Jensen went on, and May Price herself, in the sense that a person continues in memory, and in the ripples they leave in the lives they touched, went on too. She is going on right now, here, in this telling. 100 years after the night of February 9th, her story is being spoken and heard and carried forward. She is not forgotten. There is a poem that I keep thinking of as I tell this story, though I will not recite it here because it belongs to someone else. But the thought it contains, the thought that the dead are not gone as long as they are remembered, that remembering is an act of presence rather than an act of mourning. That thought feels true and important when I think about May Price. She was a woman who was present in the lives of the people around her. She made herself felt, in all the ways that good people make themselves felt, through care and reliability and the particular quality of attention that tells people they are seen and valued. Her death took her physical presence away, but it did not and could not take away the fact of what she had been and what she had meant. Those of you listening tonight have, in some small way, brought her into your present. And that matters. It always matters. Let me take you now through the city of Boston on a day that has nothing to do with the Hotel Hollis case. A day I am inventing to give you a sense of what the world looked like when all of this was happening. Let me take you through it slowly, the way you might walk through it if you had somehow been transported back and given an ordinary Tuesday in February of 1925. The cold is the first thing. Boston in February is determinately cold, in the way of a city that has been doing winter for 3 centuries and has no particular plans to apologize for it. The harbor brings cold off the Atlantic, and the river brings cold off the bay, and the streets funnel it between the buildings in ways that make you lean into your coat, and tighten your scarf without quite deciding to do so. The breath of the people on the street comes out in small clouds that dissolve almost immediately in the air. The city smells of coal smoke and horse and the sharp green smell of winter. And underneath those things, in the particular neighborhoods near the theater district, you can sometimes catch a note of food from a kitchen somewhere. The particular warmth of a restaurant doing its breakfast service, the bread and the coffee, and the barely detectable sweetness of something being fried. These smells are the smells of human life continuing, insisting on continuing, in the cold and the darkness of February. The streets near the Hotel Hollis would have been busy in the way that theater district streets are busy, not the constant commercial bustle of a market district, but the particular rhythm of a neighborhood organized around evening activity. In the mornings and the early afternoons, it was relatively quiet. Theater people kept late hours and late mornings, and the streets reflected this. But as the afternoon moved toward evening, things picked up. The theaters opened their doors for the evening performances, and the crowds came in from the streetcars and on foot and in the occasional automobile, dressed in their going-out clothes. The women in their mid-20s length skirts and their hats, the men in their suits, all of them moving with the purposeful pleasure of people who are going somewhere they want to go. Mae Price would have known this rhythm well. She would have been part of it, moving through the backstage world while the audience moved through the front-of-house world, preparing and maintaining and fixing and organizing while the performers prepared and performed. Her view of the theater was different from the audience's view, more practical, less glamorous, but in its own way more intimate. She saw the seams of the thing. She saw it from the inside, where all the work happened. On the morning of February 10th, the day after her death, all of this continued. The street in front of the Hotel Hollis was ordinary. The theater district was preparing for another day of whatever that February Tuesday held. People walked past the hotel without knowing what had happened inside it. The city went on, as cities always do, in the wake of the private tragedies that happen within them. Inside the hotel, of course, things were not ordinary. The police presence, the interviews, the processing of the crime scene, all of this made the hotel a different kind of place for the duration of the immediate investigation. The guests on the fourth floor, and eventually all the guests, were aware that something had happened. The particular hushed quality of a hotel where something terrible has occurred is different from ordinary hotel quiet. It is a quiet that knows something and is being careful around the knowing. The staff of the Hotel Hollis handled this with the professionalism that hotel staff are trained to and expected to maintain in all circumstances, which is to say they were helpful and cooperative and deeply shaken. They answered questions. They provided records. They thought carefully about who they had seen and when and what those people had looked like and what had seemed ordinary and what had not. And slowly, through that cooperative effort, the picture of the hotel in the days leading up to and on the night of February 9th began to emerge. The picture that emerged was not comforting. It was a picture of a hotel in which a man had been hiding in plain sight, or nearly in plain sight, for several days, planning, watching, preparing. He had been registered, legally, under a false name. He had paid his bill, presumably with the cash that men of his particular profession tended to carry. He had not attracted enough notice to be remembered with any specificity until the photograph arrived and unlocked the desk clerk's memory. He had been the kind of guest who doesn't register as significant, not remarkable, not alarming, not the thing you think about at the end of your shift when you're reviewing the day. This is how these things happen. This is the actual mechanism of these crimes, stripped of the narrative convenience that stories impose on them. No one noticed because there was nothing, in the moment, to notice. No alarm, no obvious wrongness, no clear signal. Just a man checking in, paying cash, staying for a few days, checking out, and then coming back. The question of how Frank Corey got back into the hotel after his checkout is one that the record addresses only obliquely. Hotels in that era did not have the kind of electronic security that modern hotels have. No key cards, no electronic locks, no cameras. Access was managed through human attention, which is to say, through the attentiveness of staff who noticed who came in and who went out, and whether they were guests or not. A man who had been a guest of the hotel, and who knew the layout and the patterns of the staff, and who carried himself with the easy confidence of someone who belonged where he was could, in theory, have returned to the building without registering as an unauthorized presence. This is easier to do in a busy hotel than in a quiet one. It is easier in the evening than in the middle of the afternoon. It is easier when the staff's attention is divided among multiple guests and multiple tasks than when things are slow. February 9th was a Tuesday evening. There had been a birthday party on the 6th floor. The hotel was at its normal level of activity for a weeknight. Not packed, but not empty. Staff were managing their normal duties. And at some point in the early evening, it appears that someone who should not have been in the building was in the building, moving through it with sufficient confidence and sufficient familiarity to go unnoticed. This is the moment that the key from room 606 becomes most significant. If you have a key in your hand, you belong somewhere. If you have a key in your hand and you move with the manner of someone who has a right to be where they are, you are invisible. And a man who had spent days in that building, learning it, understanding how it worked, knowing which corridors led where and which staircases were less traveled, would have been able to move through it even without a key. The key was insurance. The confidence was the actual mechanism. By the time the birthday party was winding down on the 6th floor, the hotel had begun to settle into its evening quiet. The theater-going crowd had gone to the theaters. The guests who were staying in had retired to their rooms. The corridors were empty and the elevators were slow, and the night staff were moving through their routines with the unhurried efficiency of people who have done these things many hundreds of times. Somewhere in that settling, in that quiet, room 406 received its uninvited occupant. The door was opened by some means, a key, a technical knowledge of the lock, a door that had not quite latched properly, some combination of access and opportunity that the record does not specify precisely. And someone went in. And someone made themselves invisible in the most literal sense available. They got under the bed and they waited. The how of this is almost secondary, in the end, to the why of it. We understand the what mostly. We understand the who, with the confidence that a jury ultimately endorsed. The why, in the sense of what drove this particular man to do this particular thing to this particular woman, is the question that the official record does not fully answer. The money was the proximate cause. But why this hotel? Why this woman? Why this degree of violence? Those questions drift into the unanswerable. And I leave them there, floating in the dark between what we know and what we can only wonder, because that is where they live, and because trying to force an answer onto them would be dishonest. Some things in real stories remain unknown. Some corners of real cases remain unlit. And in the Hotel Hollis mystery, the darkest corner, the mind and the motivations of the man who hid under the bed and waited, is one of those corners that history cannot fully illuminate. What we can know is May Price, and we know her well enough to understand what was lost. The morning after a verdict is a particular kind of morning. Whether the verdict has been good or bad, whether it has brought relief or devastation, the morning after is a morning in which the world goes on exactly as it did before, indifferent to whatever the previous day decided. The birds are outside. The coffee still needs to be made. The light comes in through whatever windows are available and falls on whatever surfaces it falls on, and the day begins. For Thomas Harvey, the morning after the not guilty verdict in the murder trial of Frank Corey was presumably a very hard morning. Not the hardest of his life. He had probably had harder mornings, because a man does not reach the rank of sergeant in a city police department without encountering a variety of hard mornings. But hard in a specific way. The kind of hard that is made harder by the certainty that you are right and the outcome is wrong, by the particular helplessness of having done everything correctly and watched it not be enough. He got up, presumably. He made his coffee, or had it made, or went somewhere where coffee was available and drank it standing up in the distracted way of a person who is thinking about something else. He went to the station. He sat at his desk, and the file was there. The file was always there, in the version of this story that I find most true to the character of the man as the record reveals him. He did not put the file away. He did not send it to archives, or close the case, or accept that it was finished. He looked at it the morning after the acquittal, and he thought about it. And somewhere in that thinking, in the particular quality of attention that Harvey brought to things that mattered, something began to form. A robbery charge. There had been a robbery. The money was gone. The money was part of the crime. And the crime had multiple dimensions that the first trial had addressed as a single unit. What if they were addressed separately? What if the robbery was the charge, built on its own evidence, without the burden of proving murder? This is, I believe, roughly how the thinking went. The detail I cannot provide is the specific conversation in which Harvey raised this with the district attorney's office, or who first articulated the possibility, or exactly what sequence of discussions led to the decision to pursue a second charge. These conversations happened in offices and over telephones and in the margins of other meetings, in the ordinary, unremarkable way that the most important decisions sometimes happen. They were not recorded in the way that courtroom proceedings are recorded. They exist only in their outcomes. The outcome was the second trial. And the second trial was, for Harvey, something like vindication. Not the vindication of a murder verdict, which would have been cleaner and more complete, but the vindication of his certainty that Frank Corey was guilty of something terrible and that the system had more to say about it than the first jury's verdict had said. I want to tell you something about vindication, about the real thing rather than the dramatic version. The real thing is quieter than you expect. It does not arrive with music. It arrives in the ordinary morning, in the ordinary office, when someone who has been waiting for the right outcome reads a document or receives a call, or hears the words that tell them the thing they believed has been officially confirmed. And there is something that might be relief, and something that might be satisfaction, and something that might be tiredness, because getting to vindication took so much out of you that you are not entirely sure you have enough left to properly appreciate it. Harvey must have felt something like this when the robbery verdict came in. The certainty that had sustained him through a year of patient work, through the frustration of the acquittal, through the patient construction of the second case. That certainty had been validated. Not in the way he had originally hoped for, not with the word murder on the verdict form, but validated. He was right. The jury agreed that Frank Corey had done something terrible at the Hotel Hollis on the night of February 9th, 1925. And the judge had agreed that the appropriate response to that terrible thing was life imprisonment. It is enough. It is not everything, but it is enough. I want to shift now to a broader reflection on what this case tells us about the nature of justice in its institutional form, not to make an argument about policy or law, but simply to observe what the Hotel Hollis case demonstrates through its specific example. The first thing it demonstrates is that justice is slower than we want it to be. We want it to be swift. We want the crime and the consequence to be closely connected in time. We want the delay between harm and accountability to be short enough that the connection is clear and unmistakable. In reality, justice in complex cases often takes the time it takes, which is longer than anyone involved finds comfortable. The Hotel Hollis case took well over a year from the murder to the final conviction, with a failed trial in the middle and a period of active cold caseness before the crucial break. That is slow. It requires patience from the investigators, from the witnesses, from the families of victims, from the community watching. The second thing it demonstrates is that justice is more fragile than we want it to be. The acquittal on the murder charge was a fragile moment, a moment in which the whole edifice of Harvey's work and the prosecution's case and the testimony of Miss Jensen and the identification of the hotel clerk could have simply collapsed and remained collapsed, with no further recourse. Legally, it could have ended there. Frank Corey could have walked out of that courthouse and never been brought back. The fact that he wasn't, that Harvey and the prosecutors found another angle and built another case, is not the result of any built-in resilience of the system. It is the result of specific people refusing to accept a specific outcome as final when their conscience told them it wasn't right. The third thing it demonstrates is that justice sometimes arrives through unexpected channels. The robbery conviction is, in its legal structure, genuinely separate from the murder acquittal. It is a real and legitimate charge arising from real and legitimately different evidence. But everyone who followed the case understood that the robbery conviction was also, in effect, a reckoning for the murder. The legal channels through which that reckoning arrived were unexpected. No one at the beginning of this case would have predicted that the resolution would take this form. But unexpected channels sometimes lead to right outcomes, and this is one of those times. And the fourth thing, and perhaps the most important thing, that this case demonstrates is that justice sometimes depends on a single person deciding not to stop. If Thomas Harvey had put the file away when his colleagues moved on, the Hotel Hollis case would have remained one of Boston's many cold cases, a file in an archive, a reference in some history of the period, a crime that was noted and forgotten. Instead, it is a case that was ultimately, slowly, imperfectly, through a back door, resolved. And the resolution happened because one person kept the file on his desk and kept asking questions and refused to accept that not having answers yet was the same as there being no answers. This is perhaps the most useful thing about the Hotel Hollis mystery, considered as a story rather than a historical event. It demonstrates the actual, specific importance of persistence in the face of discouragement. It demonstrates what one person's refusal to give up can ultimately produce. And it does this not through a fictional hero with extraordinary gifts or impossible luck, but through a real person doing real work in a real institution that was sometimes aligned with his goals and sometimes not. Thomas Harvey was not famous. He is not in the history books. The Hotel Hollis case is, as I mentioned early in this telling, one that most people have never heard of. But within the case, he is the reason that the story has the ending it has. Without him, it ends with a cold case. With him, it ends with a life sentence. That is the specific, concrete, measurable difference that one person's persistence made. I find that comforting in a way that is worth sharing. The world is full of cases that went cold, crimes that went unpunished, questions that were never answered. The Hotel Hollis case is a case that almost joined that list and didn't. And the reason it didn't is human and specific and not magical at all. It is the reason of a man who kept his file on his desk and kept coming back to it. There is something hopeful in that, if you are willing to look at it from a certain angle. Not naive hope, not the hope that every case will be resolved and every guilty person will be caught. The record does not support that kind of hope. But the specific, grounded hope that comes from seeing what one person's sustained attention can accomplish. That kind of hope is not about guarantees. It is about possibilities. And the Hotel Hollis case is a real historical example of one of those possibilities being realized. Let that be something you carry with you as you drift toward sleep tonight. Not the darkness of the crime, but the light of its eventual resolution. The persistence that made the difference. The women and men who refused to look away. The story that, 100 years later, is still being told. Before we close the Hotel Hollis chapter and prepare to rest, I want to return one final time to the building itself. The hotel, the physical place where all of this happened. Hotels are interesting structures for the holding of stories because they are designed to be temporary. They are built to house people in transit, people who are going somewhere, people who have just arrived, people who are between one place and another. They are places of impermanence by design, and yet the stories that happen within them have a permanence that the buildings themselves often outlast. The Hotel Hollis in Boston is not the building it was in 1925. The Boston of 1925 is not the city it was. The theater district has changed, and the streets have changed, and the particular configuration of cobblestone and gaslight and theater marquee and hotel sign that made up the world of May Price's Last Night is long gone, replaced by different configurations of concrete and electric light, and changed names and changed purposes. But the story is still here. The file exists, somewhere in the archives of the Boston Police Department and in the records of whatever courts handled the trials. The newspaper accounts exist in the archives of the libraries that preserve them. The memories of the people involved are gone with those people, but the records of what they said and did remain, in the careful bureaucratic script of 1920s legal proceedings and the slightly less careful but more vivid script of 1920s journalism. And now the story exists here, in this telling, in this particular form, shaped for the quiet of the night, for the kind of listening you do with your eyes closed and your body at rest, for the particular quality of attention that belongs to the hours between midnight and morning. It has traveled from a hotel corridor in February of 1925 to wherever you are right now. And that journey is itself remarkable, if you think about it. 100 years across time, from a specific room in a specific building to your particular ear in your particular place. Stories travel. They travel through time and through memory and through the various forms they take. The courtroom record, the newspaper article, the history book, the podcast, the video, this telling tonight. And in every form they take, they carry something of the original moment, the original people, the original weight of what happened. Something is always lost in translation. There is no way to fully convey the specific quality of the night of February 9th, 1925. No way to make you feel the specific cold of that Boston winter or the specific quality of silence in that hotel corridor. But something is always preserved too. The facts, the names, the sequence of events, the questions that were asked and the answers that were given, and the questions that remained unanswered. May Price, William Price, Thomas Harvey, Miss May Jensen, Frank Corey, Dr. Timothy Leary, Judge Lowry. These names are preserved. The people behind them are not gone in the full sense, because they are still here in the record, still capable of being known, still capable of affecting whoever encounters their story. May Price is still capable of being grieved 100 years after her death. Harvey is still capable of being admired. Miss Jensen is still capable of being seen as the thing she was, a witness who told the truth and kept telling it. This is what I believe about stories like this one, told in the way I try to tell them. They are not primarily about the crime, though the crime is their occasion. They are about the people. The crime is the terrible event that reveals who people are, who they were when they were alive, who they became in response to what happened, what qualities they showed in the aftermath. May Price showed courage, fighting back. Harvey showed persistence. Miss Jensen showed integrity. The Brown Derby Company showed love. Bill Price showed grief that was real and recognized. All of these qualities, courage, persistence, integrity, love, grief, are human universals. They are not particular to 1925 or to Boston or to the theatrical world or to any of the specific circumstances of this case. They are available in any time and any place and to any person who encounters circumstances that call for them. And in telling the story of the people who showed these qualities in this specific case, I am in a small way pointing to those qualities themselves and saying, these matter. These are what we are talking about, under the surface of the crime and the investigation and the trial. This is why true crime, when it is told with the right kind of care, is not merely titillating or frightening, but genuinely useful. It is a way of looking at human beings under pressure and seeing what they are made of. It is a way of understanding the range of human action, from the worst to the best, through specific real examples rather than abstract principles. And in the specific real example of the Hotel Hollis case, what you see is a range that goes from the cold deliberateness of the crime to the warm persistence of the investigation, from the worst of what human beings can do to the best. I have told you this story, and you have listened, and now I want you to do something simple. I want you to take a slow breath in. Let it fill your lungs, and let your chest rise with it, and hold it for just a second, 1 second of stillness. And then let it go. Let it all go. The story, the details, the questions that don't have answers. Let them settle into the background, into the part of your mind that holds things while you sleep. They will be there in the morning if you want them. But right now, you don't have to hold them. You are safe. The night outside your window is just the night, ordinary and quiet and not asking anything of you. The sounds around you are familiar. Your body is warm. You have been a good listener tonight. You have paid attention to something that mattered, and that attention was a gift to May Price, who deserved to be remembered, and to yourself, who needed something to listen to in the dark. Rest. There is a particular kind of peace that comes at the end of a long story, and I want to stay in that peace for a while before I fully close this chapter. I want to move through it slowly, the way you move through the last pages of a book that you don't quite want to end. The Hotel Hollis mystery, as I have come to think of this case, is not merely a mystery in the whodunit sense. Though it has elements of that, certainly, the search for the identity of the perpetrator and the slow assembly of evidence that eventually revealed him. It is a mystery in a deeper sense, the sense in which the most interesting questions are not the ones the legal system can answer. The legal system can answer, and did answer, the question of who, Frank Corey, to the satisfaction of at least one jury. It answered the question of what, through the testimony of Dr. Leary and the evidence of the crime scene. It addressed the question of how, through the under-the-bed theory and the key from room 606 and the knowledge of the building that a brief stay as a registered guest would have provided. But the legal system cannot fully answer the question of why. Not why in the specific psychological sense. What drove this man? What was the combination of need and opportunism and violent tendency that produced this outcome? And not why in the broader philosophical sense, which is the sense in which the most unanswerable whys always live. Why was May Price, who had given so much to the people around her, who had been trusted and loved and called by a name that expressed that love, why was she the one in room 406 that night? Why was the money she was carrying the thing that made her a target? Why did Harvey keep going when the case had gone cold and the reasonable expectation was that it would stay cold? Why did Miss Jensen remember clearly enough to make an identification that held up through 2 trials? Why did the second case succeed where the first had failed? Some of these whys have partial answers. Harvey kept going because that was who he was. Miss Jensen remembered because she was the kind of observer who remembers. The second case succeeded because the prosecutors built it more carefully and found better structured evidence. But all of these partial answers have their own whys underneath them, and those whys have whys. And at some point you arrive at the bedrock of human reality, which is that things happen because people are who they are and do what they do. And understanding the specific what of any event is as much as we can generally hope for. I find this, in a strange way, comforting. Not because uncertainty is comfortable. It isn't, exactly, but because it means that the story is real. Real stories don't have complete answers. Real people don't have simple motivations. Real events don't resolve into neat explanations. The Hotel Hollis case is real in exactly this way. It has its answers and its remaining questions, its resolved elements and its persistent mysteries, its official ending and its genuine irresolution. And in that combination of resolution and irresolution, it is a very good story. It is the kind of story that stays with you, that you carry out of the listening and back into your daily life, that surfaces occasionally as a thought or a memory or a question, that becomes part of the collection of real things you hold in your mind about what the world is like and what people are capable of. I want to leave you with the image I find most compelling from this entire case. It is not the crime scene, and it is not the courtroom, and it is not the dramatic moment of the arrest in Worcester. It is simpler than any of those things, and quieter, and more human. It is the image of May Price on a train. I am imagining her, which means this is not history, but reconstruction, the kind of reconstruction that honors what we know by trying to make it present. She is on a train heading somewhere, heading to Boston for the engagement, perhaps, or heading somewhere else on one of the hundreds of journeys her work required her to make. The train is moving through the winter landscape, the fields bare and the trees skeletal against a white sky, and May Price is in her seat with some practical task in front of her, mending something, reviewing a list, writing a letter. The train car smells of coal smoke and wool, and the particular cold fresh smell that comes in when someone opens a door between cars, and the rhythms of the track beneath her are so familiar by now that she doesn't consciously register them. She is thinking about the next stop, about what needs to be done when she gets there, what needs to be checked and prepared and organized. She is the wardrobe mistress, the keeper of things, the person whose attention to detail makes the whole enterprise possible. She is thinking about costumes and logistics and the practical matters that make up the fabric of her working life. And she is probably, somewhere under the practical thinking about Bill, about going home, about New York and the ordinary comforts of the life she has made there alongside her work. She is probably looking forward to it the way people look forward to ordinary things that they have learned to value. Not dramatically, not with the intensity of some great longing, but with the quiet, warm anticipation of someone who knows what home means and is glad of it. She is alive in that image. She is fully, specifically alive, a person with a history and a future and a present that is full of the small textures of her particular life. She is not yet the victim of a crime. She is not yet the center of a police investigation or a newspaper story or a trial. She is May Price, wardrobe mistress, wife, colleague, the woman they called mother, on a train going somewhere. That is who she was. And that is who she is, in the version of her that lives in this story. Not the victim, not the evidence, not the impetus for an investigation. Just a person, moving through the world, full of the ordinary specificity that makes any one human life irreplaceable and worth remembering. I hope you remember her. I hope that's the thing you carry out of tonight. Not the darkness of what happened, but the light of who she was. The reliable one, the trusted one, the one with the needle and thread and the measured tape and the coffee and the listening ear. The mother of the troop. Her story was not over when it seemed to end. It was extended by the people who refused to forget it. And tonight, it has been extended again, here, in this quiet dark, wherever you are listening from. That's something. That's really something. Let your breath slow. Let your muscles release, one by one, from your feet up through your legs, and your back, and your shoulders, and your face. Let the weight of the day, whatever it held, whatever it asked of you, let it settle into the surface beneath you, and let the surface hold it. You don't have to carry it tonight. The story is told. May Price has been remembered. The night is quiet. Rest now, my sleepy friends. You've done good work tonight by listening. And so we come to the final stretch of this long and careful journey. This 100-year-old story that has been moving through the dark toward you, reaching you here in this particular night of this particular year, finding you wherever you have settled to listen. Before I say goodnight, I want to pull together the threads of what this story has given us. Not to summarize it in the way of a school report, but to let it settle fully, the way the last light settles at the end of a long day. The Hotel Hollis mystery is, at its core, a story about what it means to hold on. Every person in this story who matters most. May Price, who held on to life with everything she had in her last moments. Thomas Harvey, who held on to a case when every institutional force was pointing toward letting it go. Miss May Jensen, who held on to a memory and held on to her testimony through 2 trials and an acquittal and the pressure of uncertainty. The members of the Brown Derby Company, who held on to each other in the aftermath of something that could have broken them. All of these people demonstrate, in different ways, the same quality. The refusal to let go of what matters. Holding on is not glamorous, as I have said. It is not the quality that makes for the most exciting chapter of any story. But it is the quality that determines the ending of this one, and maybe of every story where the ending matters. Frank Corey, in a way, also held on to his silence, held on to his denial, held on to the strategy that had served him through the interrogation room and the first trial. But holding on is not always the same as prevailing. And in this case, the holding on of the people who were right outlasted the holding on of the person who wasn't. There is justice in that. Not the perfect justice that would have come with a murder conviction. Not the clean, narrative satisfaction of a story that resolves exactly as it should. But real justice. The justice of a world where, sometimes, persistence and integrity and the refusal to accept a wrong outcome actually produce a better one. That kind of justice is available in the real world, imperfectly and inconsistently, and when it appears, it deserves to be recognized and honored. The Hotel Hollis mystery produced that kind of justice. Through the long, exhausting, imperfect path of 2 trials and an acquittal and a second charge and a life sentence, it produced an outcome that was right. The wrong person went to prison. The person who was guilty went to prison. And he stayed there. Now, I want to do something for you before I close. I want to remind you of something that you may have partially forgotten in the course of this long story, because long stories have a way of pulling you away from yourself and into their world, and it is good, at the end, to be reminded of where you are. You are safe. You are in a place that is known to you, surrounded by objects and sounds and smells that are familiar. The night outside is just the night. It is not threatening you. It is not asking anything of you. It is simply the ordinary dark that falls every evening and lifts every morning and has been doing so for longer than any human story can reach. You are warm, or warm enough. Your body is doing the things it does, breathing, circulating, maintaining you with the quiet competence of a body that knows what it's doing. And you have spent time tonight with something that matters. You have given your attention to a story about real people in a real place in real history, and your attention is not a small thing. Attention is the most finite and most valuable resource any of us has, and the choice to spend it on something, rather than on the millions of other things you could be paying attention to, is a choice that matters. You chose to pay attention to May Price, to Thomas Harvey, to the world of 1925 Boston and the Hotel Hollis and the long, patient, imperfect work of justice. That choice honored the people in this story. It kept their story alive for the duration of your listening. And that is enough. That is, in fact, more than enough. If you are still awake, and some of you will be, because there are always some of you who come for the story and end up lying in the dark, eyes open, thinking about the questions that don't have answers, then I want to hear from you. Tell me, in the comments, what stayed with you. Tell me which part of this story settled into you most deeply. Was it May Price on the train, which I invented for you, but which I believe was real in all the ways that matter? Was it Harvey at his desk, keeping the file alive? Was it Miss Jensen in the corridor, turning around and leaving because something told her to? Tell me. I read every comment. This community, the people who come here in the dark and listen together without being in the same room. You matter to me, and what you think and feel about these stories matters. And if you have not yet subscribed, please do that now. Not because I need the number, but because subscribing means you will be here the next time. You will hear the next story. You will spend another quiet hour in the dark with something that matters, with a person who deserves to be remembered, with a mystery that refuses to fully resolve. These stories are waiting. They have been waiting for a very long time. They will keep waiting, patiently, as only old stories can. But I would like you to be there when they are told. Like the video, if this story gave you something. Not as a transaction, not as a payment for a service. As an acknowledgement, a quiet, one-button gesture that says, yes, this mattered. Yes, I was here. Yes, I listened. And now, my sleepy friends, we come to the end. The Hotel Hollis stands in 1925 Boston, or the memory of it does, with its fourth-floor corridor, and its sixth-floor party, and its desk clerk who noticed things, and its bellboy who ran to the station with words that changed everything. Thomas Harvey sits at his desk with the file in front of him, patient and unwilling to stop. Miss May Jensen walks away from a corridor encounter that frightens her before she knows why. May Price packs her bags for a morning train to New York, mostly packed, nearly ready to go home. These moments are fixed now, fixed in the record and in the memory and in the telling and in your listening. They cannot be changed. They happened, and they will always have happened, in the particular permanence that the past has. The morning of February 10th, 1925 is permanent. The bellboy's words are permanent. May Price's courage in fighting back is permanent. Harvey's persistence is permanent. The life sentence, when it came, is permanent. And now this story, told in this form, on this night, is permanent too. It happened here. You listened. That is real, and it is done, and it cannot be undone. It is enough to close the night with. More than enough. Sleep well. You are safe. The dark outside is ordinary, and the sounds around you are familiar, and the morning is coming in its own time, not hurrying, not late. You have honored someone worth honoring tonight, and that is a good thing to have done. Good night, my sleepy friends. Good night from Mr. Midnight. I will be here when you come back. The Hotel Hollis mystery rests now, in the quiet dark, in the 100-year-old archive of things that happened and were remembered and were told again and again, each time to someone new. Each time in a different dark and a different year and a different listening ear. It rests with May Price, who was the wardrobe mistress and the keeper of things, and the woman they called mother, and the woman who fought back, and the woman who is still, all these years later, here. Good night.